Time passed quickly, as it always does when there is work to do. Round the ruined houses the grey grass turned green again. In the travesties of gardens early spring flowers began to show a touch of colour. The first of them greeted Sara Lee one morning as she stood on her doorstep in the early sun. She gathered them and placed them, one on each grave, in the cemetery near the poplar trees, where small wooden crosses, sometimes surmounted by a cap, marked many graves. Marie, a silent, subdued Marie, worked steadily in the little house. She did not weep, but now and then Sara Lee found her stirring something on the stove and looking toward the quiet mill in the fields. And once Sara Lee, surprising that look on her face, put her arms about the girl and held her for a moment. But she did not say anything. There was nothing to say. With the opening up of the spring came increased movement and activity among the troops. The beach and the sand dunes round La Panne were filled with drilling men, Belgium's new army. Veterans of the winter, at rest behind the lines, sat in the sun and pared potatoes for the midday meal. Convalescents from the hospital appeared in motley garments from the ambulance ocean and walked along the water front, where the sea, no longer grey and sullen, rolled up in thin white lines of foam to their very feet. Winter straw came out of wooden sabots. Winter-bitten hands turned soft. Canal boats blossomed out with great washings. And the sentry at the gun emplacements in the sand up the beach gave over gathering sticks for his fire, and lay, when no one was about, in a hollow of the dune, face to the sky. So spring came to that small fragment of Belgium which had been saved. Spring and hope. Soon now the great and powerful Allies would drive out the Huns, and all would be as it had been. Splendid rumours were about. The Germans were already yielding at La Bassée. There was to be a great drive along the entire front, and hopefully one would return home in time for the spring planting. A sort of informal council took place occasionally in the little house. Maps replaced the dressings on the table in the salle à manger, and junior officers, armed with Sara Lee's box of pins, thrust back the enemy at various points and proved conclusively that his position was untenable. They celebrated these paper victories with Sara Lee's tea, and went away the better for an hour or so of hope and tea and a girl's soft voice and quiet eyes. Now and then there was one, of course, who lagged behind his fellows, with a yearning tenderness in his face that a glance from the girl would have quickly turned to love. But Sara Lee had no coquetry. When, as occasionally happened, there was a bit too much fervor when her hand was kissed, she laid it where it belonged, to loneliness and the spring, and became extremely maternal and very, very kind, which, both of them, are the death blows to young love. The winter floods were receding. Along the Yser Canal mud-caked flats began to appear, and here and there rusty tangles of barbed wire. And with the lessening of the flood came new activities to the little house. The spring drive was coming. There was spring, indeed, everywhere but in Henri's heart. Day after day messages were left with Sara Lee by men in uniform, sometimes letters, sometimes a word, and these she faithfully cared for until such time as Jean came for them. Now and then it was Henri who came, but when he stayed in the village he made his headquarters at the house of the mill. There was sacking over the windows. He wrote his reports by lamplight, reports which Jean carried back to the villa in the fishing village by the sea. However, though he no longer came and went as before, Henri made frequent calls at the House of Mercy. But now he came in the evenings, when the place was full of men. Sara Lee was doing more dressings than before. The semi-armistice of winter was over, and there were nights when a row of wounded men lay on the floor in the little salle à manger and waited, in a sort of dreadful quiet, to be taken away. Rumors came of hard fighting further along the line, and sometimes, on nights when the clouds hung low, the flashes of the guns at Ypres looked like incessant lighting. From the sand dunes at Nieuport and Dixmude there was firing also, and the air seemed sometimes to be full of scouting planes. The Canadians were moving toward the front at Neuve Chapelle at that time, and one day a lorry, piled high with boxes, rolled and thumped down the street and halted by Rene. "Rather think we are lost," explained the driver, sheepishly grinning at Rene. There were 4 boys in khakis on the truck, not a word of French among them. Sara Lee, who rolled her own bandages now, heard the speech and came out. "Good gracious!" she said, and gave an alarmed glance at the sky. But it was the noon hour, when every good German abandons war for food, and the sky was empty. The boys cheered perceptibly. Here at last was some one who spoke a Christian tongue. "Must have taken the wrong turning, miss," said one of them, saluting. "Where do you want to go?" she asked. "You are very close to the Belgian Front here. It is not at all safe." They all saluted, then staring at her curiously, told her. "Dear me," said Sara Lee. "You are a long way off, and a long way from home, too." They smiled. They looked, with their clean shaven faces, absurdly young after the bearded Belgian soldiers. "I am an American, too," said Sara Lee with just a touch of homesickness in her voice. She had been feeling lonely lately. "If you have time to come in, I could give you luncheon. René, call us if any German air machines come over." Would they come in? Indeed, yes. They crawled down off the lorry and took off their caps and ate every particle of food in the house. And then, though they were mutely curious at first, soon they were asking questions. How long had she been there? What did she do? Wasn't it dangerous? "Not so dangerous as it looks," said Sara Lee, smiling. "The Germans seldom bother the town now. It's not worth while." Later on they went over the house. They climbed the broken staircase and stared toward the break in the poplar trees from the roofless floor above. "Some girl," one of them said in an undertone. The others were gazing intently towards the Front. Never before had they been so close. Never had they seen a ruined town. War, until now, had been a thing of Valcartier, of a long voyage, of much drill in the mud at Salisbury Plain. Now here they saw, at their feet, what war could do. "Damn them!" said one of the boys suddenly. "Fellows, we'll get back at them soon." So they went away, a trifle silent and very grateful. But before they left they had a glimpse of Sara Lee's room, with the corner gone, and Harvey's picture on the mantel. "Some girl," they repeated as they drove up the street. It was the tribute of inarticulate youth. Sara Lee went back to her bandages and her thoughts. She had not a great deal of time to think, what with the officers stopping in to fight their paper and pin battles, and with letters to write and dressings to make and supplies to order. She began to have many visitors, officers from the French lines, correspondents on tours of the Front, and once even an English cabinet member, who took 6 precious lumps of sugar in his tea and dug a piece of shell out of the wall with his pocket knife as a souvenir. Once a British aviator brought his machine down in the field by the mill, and walked over with the stiff stride of a man who has been for hours in the air. She gave him tea and bread and butter, and she learned then of the big fighting that was to come. When she was alone she thought about Henri. Generally her thoughts were tender. Always they were grateful. But she was greatly puzzled. He had said that he loved her. Then, if he loved her, why should he not be gentle and kind to her? Men did not hurt the women they loved. And because she was hurt, she was rather less than just. He had not asked her to marry him. He had said that he loved her, but that was different. And the insidious poison of Harvey's letter about foreigners began to have its effect. The truth was that she was tired. The strain was telling on her. And at a time when she needed every moral support Henri had drawn off behind a wall of misery, and all her efforts at a renewal of their old friendship only brought up against a sort of stony despair. There were times, too, when she grew a little frightened. She was alone. What if Henri went away altogether? What if he took away the little car and his protection and the supplies that came so regularly? It was not a selfish fear. It was for her work that she trembled. For the first time she realized her complete dependence on his good will. And now and then she felt that it would be good to see Harvey again, and be safe from all worry, and not have to depend on a man who loved her as Henri did. For that she never doubted. Inexperienced as she was in such matters, she knew that the boy loved her. Just how wildly she did not know until later, too late to undo what the madness had done. Then one day a strange thing happened. It had been raining, and when in the late afternoon the sun came out it gleamed in the puddles that filled the shell holes in the road, and set to a red blaze the windows of the house of the mill. First, soaring overhead, came half a dozen friendly planes. Next, The eyes of the enemy having thus been blinded, so to speak, there came a regiment of fresh troops, swinging down the street, for all the world as though the German army was safely drinking beer in Munich. They passed René, standing open-mouthed in the doorway, and one wag of a Belgian boy, out of sheer joy of spring, did the goose-step as he passed the little sentry and, head screwed round in the German salute, crossed his eyes over his impudent nose. Came, then, the planes. Came the regiment, which turned off into a field and there spread itself, like a snake uncoiling, into a double line. Came a machine, grey and battered, containing officers. Came a general, with a gold braid on his shoulder and a pleasant smile. Came the strange event. The general found Sara Lee and the salle à manger cutting cotton into 3-inch squares, and he stood in the doorway and bowed profoundly. "Mademoiselle Kennedy?" he inquired. Sara Lee replied to that, and then gave a quick thought to her larder, because generals usually meant tea. But this time at last Sara Lee was to receive something, not to give. She turned very white when she was told, and said she had not deserved it. She was indeed on the verge of declining, not knowing that there are certain things one does not decline. But Marie brought her hat and jacket, a smiling, tremulous Marie, and Sara Lee put them on. The general was very tall. In her short skirt and with flying hair she looked like a child beside him as they walked across the fields. Suddenly Sara Lee was terribly afraid she was going to cry. The troops stood rigidly at attention, and a cold wind flapped Sara Lee's skirts, and the guns hammered at Ypres, and the general blew on his fingers. And soon a low open car came down the street, and the King got out. Sara Lee watched him coming, his tall, slightly stooped figure, his fair hair, his plain blue uniform. Sara Lee had never seen a king before, and she had always thought of them as sitting up on a sort of platform, never as trudging through spring mud. "What shall I do?" she asked nervously. "He will shake hands, mademoiselle. Bow as he approaches. That is all." The amazing interlude, indeed. With Sara Lee being decorated by the King, and troops drawn up to do her honor, and over all the rumbling of the great guns. A palpitating and dazed Sara Lee when the decoration was fastened to her black jacket. A Sara Lee whose hat blew off at exactly the worst moment and rolled, end on end, like a hoop, into a puddle. But, oddly, she did not mind about the hat. She had only one conscious thought just then. She hoped that, whatever Uncle James might be in that world of the gone before, he might know what was happening to her, or even see it. He would have liked it. He would have believed in the Belgians and in the King. And now. The King did not go at once. He went back to the little house and went through it. And he and one of the generals climbed to the upper floor, and the King stood looking out silently towards the land that he loved, and which, for a long time, was no longer his. He came down after a time, stooping his tall figure in the low doorway, and said he would like some tea. So Marie put the kettle on, and Sara Lee and the King talked. It was all rather dazing. Every now and then she forgot certain instructions whispered her by the general, and after a time the King said, "Why do you do that, mademoiselle?" For Sara Lee, with an intent face and moving lips, had been stepping backwards. Sara Lee flushed to the eyes. "Because, sire, I was told to remain a distance of 6 feet." "But we are being informal," said the King, smiling, "and there is very little room." Sara Lee, who had been taught in the schoolroom that kings are usurpers of the divine rights of the people, Sara Lee lost just a bit of her staunch democracy that day. She saw the King of the Belgians for what he really was, a ruler, but a symbol as well. He represented his country, as the flag she loved represented hers. The flag was America, the King was Belgium. That was all. It was a very humble and flushed Sara Lee who watched the gray car go flying up the street later on. She went in and told the whole story to Harvey's picture, but it was difficult to feel that he was hearing. His eyes were turned away and his face was still set and stern. At last she gave it up. This thing which meant so much to her would never mean anything to Harvey. She knew, even then, what he would say. "Decorate you? I should think they might. Medals are cheap. Everybody over there is getting medals. You feed their men and risk your life and your reputation, and they give you a thing to pin on. It's cheap at the price." And later on those were Harvey's very words. But to be fair to him they were but the sloughing of a wound that would not heal. That evening Henri came again. He was, for the first time, his gay self again, at least on the surface. It was as though, knowing what he was going into, he would leave with Sara Lee no feeling, if he never returned, that she had inflicted a lasting hurt. He was everywhere in the little house, elbowing his way among the men with his cheery nonsense, bantering the weary ones until they smiled, carrying hot water for Sara Lee and helping her now and then with a bad dressing. "If you would do it in this fashion, mademoiselle," he would say, "with one turn of the bandage over the elbow." "But it won't hold that way." "You say that to me, mademoiselle? I, who have taught you all you know of bandaging?" They would wrangle a bit and end by doing it in Sara Lee's way. He had a fund of nonsense that he drew on, too, when a dressing was painful. It would run like this, to an early accompaniment of groans: "Pierre, what can you put in your left hand that you cannot place in the right? Stop grunting like a pig and think, man." Pierre would give a final rumble and begin to think deeply. "I cannot think. In my left hand, Monsieur le Capitaine?" "In your left hand." The little crowd in the dressing room would draw in close around the table to listen. "I do not know, monsieur." "Idiot," Henri would say. "Your right elbow, man." And the dressing was done. He had an inexhaustible stock of such riddles, almost never guessed. He would tell the answer and then laugh delightedly, and pain seemed to leave the little room when he entered it. It was that night that Henri disappeared. There was a question to settle, and it was for Henri to do it. Two questions, indeed. One was a matter of engineering, and before the bottom fell out of his world Henri had studied engineering. The second was more serious. For the first, this thing had happened. Of all the trenches to be held, the Belgians had undeniably the worst. Properly speaking, they were not trenches at all, but shallow gutters dug a foot or two into the saturated ground, and then built man high with bags of earth or sand. Here and there they were not dug at all, but were purely shelters, against a railway embankment, of planks or sandbags, and reinforced by rails from the deserted track behind which they were hidden. For this corner of Belgium had been saved by turning it into a shallow lake. By opening the gates in the dikes, the Allies had let in the sea and placed a flood in front of the advancing enemy. The battle front was a reeking pond. The opposing armies lived like duck hunters in a swamp. To dig a foot was to encounter water. Machine guns here and there sat but 6 inches above the yellow flood. Men lay in pools to fire them. To reach outposts were narrow paths built first of bags of earth, a life sometimes for every bag. And when this filling was sufficient, on top a path of fascines, bound together in bundles, made a footway. For this reason the Belgians approached their trenches not through deep cuts which gave them shelter, but with no other cover than the darkness of night. During the day they lay in their shallow dugouts, cut off from any connection with the world behind them. Food, cooked miles away, came up at night, cold and unappetizing. For water, having exhausted their canteens, there was nothing but the brackish tide before them, ill-smelling and reeking of fever. Water carts trundled forward at night, but often they were far too few. The Belgians, having faced their future through long years of anxiety, had been trained to fight. In a way they had been trained to fight a losing war, for they could not hope to defeat their greedy neighbor to the east. But now they found themselves fighting almost not at all, condemned to inactivity, to being almost passively slaughtered by enemy artillery, and to living under such conditions as would have sapped the courage of a less desperate people. To add to the difficulties, not only did the sea encroach, turning a fertile land into a salt marsh, but the winter rains, unusually heavy that tragic first winter, and lacking their usual egress to the sea, spread the flood. There were many places well back of the lines, where fields were flooded, and where roads, sadly needed, lost themselves in unfordable wallows of mud and water. Henri then, knowing all this, none better, had his first question to settle, which was this. As spring advanced the flood had commenced to recede. Time came when, in those trenches now huddled shallow behind the railway track, one could live in certain comfort. In the deeper ones the bottom of the trench appeared for the first time. On a day previous, however, the water had commenced to come back. There had been no rain, but little by little in a certain place yellow, ill-smelling little streams began to flow sluggishly into the trenches. Seeped rather than flowed. At first the Belgian officers laid it to the bad luck that had so persistently pursued them. Then they held a conference in the small brick house with its maps and pine tables and its picture of an American harvester on the wall, which was now headquarters. Sitting under the hanging lamp, with an orderly making coffee at a stove in the corner, they talked it over. Henri was there, silent before his elders, but intently listening. And at last they turned to him. "I can go and find out," he said quietly. "It is possible, though I do not see how." He smiled. "They are, I think, only drying themselves at our expense. It is a bit of German humor." But the cry of "Calais in a month" was in the air, and undoubtedly there had been renewed activity along the German front near the sea. The second question to be answered was dependent on the first. Had the Germans, as Henri said, merely shifted the water, by some clever engineering, to the Belgian trenches, or was there some bigger thing on hand? What, for instance, if they were about to attempt to drain the inundation, smash the Belgian line, and march by the Dunkirk road to Calais? So that night, when Henri jested about Pierre's right elbow and watched Sara Lee for a smile, he had difficult work before him. Sometime near midnight he slipped away. Jean was waiting in the street, and wrung the boy's hand. "I could go with you," he said rather wistfully. "You don't speak their ugly tongue. I could be mute, shell shock. You could be helping me back." But Henri only held his hand for a moment and shook his head. "You would double the risk, and what good would it do? 2 pistols are better than 1." "I have 2 pistols, my friend," said Henri, and turned the corner of the building, past the boards René had built in, and toward the house of the mill. But once out of Jean's sight he stopped a moment, his hand resting against that frail wall to Sara Lee's room. It was his good bye to her. For 3 days Jean stayed in the village. He slept at the mill, but he came for his meals to the little house. Once he went to Dunkirk and brought out provisions and the mail, including Sara Lee's monthly allowance. But mostly he sat in the mill house and waited. He could not read. "You do not eat at all, Jean," Sara Lee said to him more than once. And twice she insisted that he was feverish and placed a hand that was somewhat marred with the peelings of vegetables on his forehead. "I am entirely well, mademoiselle," he would say, and draw back. He had anxieties enough just now without being reminded by the touch of a woman's hand of all that he had lost. Long before that Sara Lee had learned not to question Jean about Henri's absences. Even his knowledge, now that she knew something of Henri's work, did not remove the barrier. So Sara Lee waited, as did Jean, but more helplessly. She knew something was wrong, but she had not Jean's privilege of going at night to the trenches and there waiting, staring over the gray water with its ugly floating shadows, for Henri to emerge from the flood. Something rather forced and mechanical there was those days in her work. Her smile was rather set. She did not sleep well. And one night she violated Henri's orders and walked across the softened fields to beyond the poplar trees. There was nothing to see except an intermittent flash from the clouds that hung low over the sea at Nieuport, where British gunboats were bombarding the coast, or the steady streaks from Ypres salient, where night and day the guns never rested. From the Belgian trenches, 1,500 feet or so away, there was no sound. A German electric signal blazed its message in code and went out quickly. Now and then a rifle shot, thin and sharp, rang out from where, under the floating starlights, keen eyes on each side watched for movements on the other. Sara Lee sat down under a tree and watched for a while. Then she found herself crying softly. It was all so sad and useless and cruel. And somewhere there ahead was Henri. Henri with his blue eyes, his smile, the ardor of his young arms. Henri, who had been to her many friends. Sara Lee had never deceived herself about Henri. She loved him. But she was quite certain she was not in love with him, which is entirely different. She knew that this last was impossible, because she was engaged to Harvey. What was probably the truth was that she loved them both in entirely different ways. Men have always insisted on such possibilities, and have even asserted their right, now and then, to love two women at the same time. But women are less frank with themselves. And, in such cases, there is no grand passion. There are tenderness, and the joy of companionship, and sometimes a touching dependence. But it is not a love that burns with a white fire. Perhaps Sara Lee was one of those women who are always loved more than they love. There are such women, not selfish, not seeking love, but softly feminine, kind, appealing, and genuine. Men need, after all, but an altar on which to lay tribute. And the high, remote white altar that was Sara Lee had already received the love of two strong men. She was not troubling her head that night, however, about being an altar, of a sort. She cried a little at first, because she was terrified for Henri, and because Jean's face was growing pinched and gray. Then she cried very hard, prone on the ground and face down, because Henri was young, and all of life should have been before him, and he was missing. Henri was undeniably missing. Even the king knew it now, and set down in his heart among the other crosses there Henri's full name, which we may not know, and took to pacing his little study and looking out at the spring sea. That night Marie, having ladled to the bottom of her kettle, found Sara Lee missing, and was told by René of the direction she had taken. Marie, muttering to herself, set out to find her, and almost stumbled over her in the wood by the road. She sat down on the ground without a word and placed a clumsy hand on the girl's shoulder. It was not until Sara Lee ceased sobbing that she spoke. "It is far from hopeless, mademoiselle." They had by now established a system of communication. Sara Lee spoke her orders in halting French, but general conversation was beyond her. And much hearing of English had taught the Belgian girl enough to follow. Sara Lee replied then, in smothered English, "He's gone, Marie. He will never come back." "Who can tell? There are many missing who are not dead." Sara Lee shuddered. For spies were not made prisoners. They had no rights as prisoners of war. Their own governments did not protect them. To Henri, capture was death. But she could not say this to Marie. Marie sat softly stroking Sara Lee's hair, her own eyes tragic and tearless. "Even if it were the other," she said, "it is not so bad to die for one's country. The thing that is terrible, that leaves behind it only bitterness and grief, and no hope, mademoiselle, even with many prayers, is that one has died a traitor." She coaxed Sara Lee back at last. They went through the fields, for fresh troops were being thrown into the Belgian trenches and the street was full of men. Gray dray horses were dragging forward batteries, heavy guns sliding and slipping. In the absence of such information as only Henri had been wont to bring, it was best to provide for the worst. The next day Jean did not come over for breakfast, and René handed Sara Lee a note. "I'm going to England," Jean had written that dawn in the house of the mill, "and from there to Holland. I can get past the barrier and shall work down toward the front. I must learn what has happened, mademoiselle. As you know, if he was captured, there is no hope. But there is an excellent chance that he is in hiding, unable to get back. Look for me in 2 weeks." There followed what instructions he had given as to her supplies, which would come as before. Beautifully written in Jean's small fine hand, it spelled for Sara Lee the last hope. She read Jean's desperation through its forced cheerfulness, and she faced for the first time a long period of loneliness in the crowded little house. She tried very hard to fill the gap that Henri had left, tried to joke with the men in her queer bits of French, was more smiling than ever, for fear she might be less. But now and then in cautious whispers she heard Henri's name, and her heart contracted with very terror. A week. 2 weeks. Twice the village was bombarded severely, but the little house escaped by a miracle. Marie considered it the same miracle that left holy pictures unhurt on the walls of destroyed houses, and allowed the frailest of old ebony and rosewood crucifixes to remain unharmed. Great generals, often as tall as they were great, stopped at the little house to implore Sara Lee to leave, but she only shook her head. "Not unless you send me away," she always said, "and that would break my heart." "But to move, mademoiselle, only to the next village. they would remonstrate, and as a final argument, "You are too valuable to risk an injury." "I must remain here," she said, and some of them thought they understood. When an unusually obdurate officer came along, Sara Lee would insist on taking him to the cellar. "You see," she would say, holding her candle high, "it is a nice cellar, warm and dry. It is," proudly, "one of the best cellars in the village. It is a really homelike cellar." The officer would go away then, and send her cigarettes for her men or, as in more than one case, a squad with bags of earth and other things to protect the little house as much as possible. After a time the little house began to represent the ideas in protection and camouflage, then in its early stages, of many different minds. René shot a man there one night, a skulking figure working its way in the shadows of the street. It was just before dawn, and René, who was sleepless those days, like others, called to him. The man started to run, dodging behind walls. But René ran faster and killed him. He was a German, in Belgian peasant's clothing. He wore the great shoes of the German soldier, and he had been making a rough map of the Belgian trenches. Sara Lee did not see him. But when she heard the shot she went out, and René told her breathlessly. From that time on her terrors took the definite form of Henri lying dead in a ruined street, and being buried, as this man was buried, without ceremony and without a prayer, in some sodden spring field. As the spring advanced, Harvey grew increasingly bitter, grew morbid and increasingly self-conscious also. He began to think that people were smiling behind his back, and when they asked about Sara Lee he met with almost insulting brevity what he felt was half contemptuous kindness. He went nowhere, worked all day and until late into the night. He did well in his business, however, and late in March he received a substantial raise in salary. He took it without enthusiasm, and told Belle that night at dinner with apathy. After the evening meal it was now his custom to go to his room and there, shut in, to read. He read no books on the war, and even the quarter column entitled Salient Points of the Day's War News hardly received a glance from him now. In the office when the talk turned to the war, as it did almost hourly, he would go out or scowl over his letters. "Harvey's hit hard," they said there. "He's acting like a rotten cub," was likely to be the next sentence. But sometimes it was, "Well, what d'you expect? Everything ready to get married, and the girl beating it to France without notice. I'd be sore myself." On the day of the raise in salary his sister got the children to bed and straightened up the litter of small garments that seemed always to bestrew the house, even to the lower floor. Then she went into Harvey's room. Coat and collar off, he was lying on the bed but not reading. His book lay beside him, and with his arms under his head he was staring at the ceiling. She did not sit down beside him on the bed. They were an undemonstrative family, and such endearments as Belle used were lavished on her children. But her eyes were kind and a little nervous. "Do you mind talking a little, Harvey?" "I don't feel like talking much. I'm tired, I guess. But go on. What is it? Bills?" She came to him in her constant financial anxieties, and always he was ready to help her out. But his tone was now gruff. A slight flush of resentment colored her cheeks. "Not this time, Harv. I was just thinking about things." "Sit down." She sat on the straight chair beside the bed, the chair on which, in neat order, Harvey placed his clothing at night, his shoes beneath, his coat over the back. "I wish you'd go out more, Harvey." "Why? Go out and talk to a lot of driveling fools who don't care for me any more than I do for them?" "That's not like you, Harv." "Sorry." His tone softened. "I don't care much about going round, Belle. That's all. I guess you know why." "So does everybody else." He sat up and looked at her. "Well, suppose they do. I can't help that, can I? When a fellow has been jilted—" "You haven't been jilted." He lay down again, his arms under his head, and Belle knew that his eyes were on Sara Lee's picture on the dresser. "It amounts to the same thing." "Harvey," Belle said, hesitatingly, "I've brought Sara Lee's report from the Ladies' Aid. May I read it to you?"
"I don't want to hear it."
"Then,
give it here. I'll look at it."
He read it carefully, his hands rather unsteady. So many men given soup, so many given chocolate, so many dressings done, and at the bottom Sara Lee's request for more money. An apologetic, rather breathless request, and closing rather primly with this: I am sure that the society will feel, from the above report, that the work is worth while and worth continuing. I am only sorry that I cannot send photographs of the men who come for aid, but as they come at night, it is impossible. I enclose, however, a small picture of the house, which is now known as the Little House of Mercy." "At night?" said Harvey. "So she's there alone with a lot of ignorant foreigners at night? Why the devil don't they come in the daytime?" "Here's the picture, Harvey." He got up then and carried the tiny photograph over close to the gas jet. There he stood for a long time, gazing at it. There was René with his rifle and his smile. There was Marie in her white apron. And in the center, the wind blowing her soft hair, was Sara Lee. Harvey groaned, and Belle came over, and putting her hand on his shoulder, looked at the photograph with him. "Do you know what I think, Harvey?" she said. "I think Sara Lee is right, and you are wrong." He turned on her almost savagely. "That's not the point," he snapped out. "I don't begrudge the poor devils their soup. What I feel is this. If she'd cared a tinker's damn for me, she'd never have gone. That's all." He returned to a moody survey of the picture. "Look at it," he said. "She insists that she's safe. But that fellow's got a gun. What for, if she's so safe? And look at that house. There's a corner shot away, and it's got no upper floor. Safe!" Belle held out her hand. "I must return the picture to the society, Harve." "Not just yet," he said ominously. "I want to look at it. I haven't got it all yet. And I'll return it myself, with a short speech." "Harvey!" "Well?" he retorted. "Why shouldn't I tell that lot of old scandalmongers what I think of them? They'll sit here safe at home and beg money. God, one of them was in the office today. And send a young girl over to You'd better get out, Belle. I'm not company for anyone tonight." She turned away, but he came after her, and suddenly putting his arms round her, he kissed her. "Don't worry about me," he said. "I'm done with wearing my heart on my sleeve. She looks happy, so I guess I can be." He released her. "Good night. I'll return the picture." He sat up very late, alternately reading the report and looking at the picture. It was unfortunate that Sara Lee had smiled into the camera. Coupled with her blowing hair, it had given her a light-heartedness, a sort of joyousness, that hurt him to the soul. He made some mad plans after he had turned out the lights, to flirt wildly with the unattached girls he knew, to go to France and confront Sara Lee and then bring her home, or He had found a way. He lay there and thought it over, and it bore the test of the broken sleep that followed. In the morning, dressing, he wondered he had not thought of it before. He was more cheerful at breakfast than he had been for weeks. In the Little House of Mercy 2 weeks went by, and then a third. Soldiers marching out to the trenches sometimes wore flowers tucked gaily in their caps. More and more Allied aeroplanes were in the air. Sometimes, standing in the streets, Sara Lee saw one far overhead, while balloon-shaped clouds of bursting shells hung far below it. Once or twice in the early morning a German plane, flying so low that one could easily see the black cross on each wing, reconnoitered the village for wagon trains or troops. Always they found it empty. Hope had almost fled now. In the afternoons Marie went to the ruined church and there knelt before the heap of marble and masonry that had once been the altar, and prayed. And Sara Lee, who had been brought up a Protestant and had never before entered a Catholic church, took to going there too. In some strange fashion the peace of former days seemed to cling to the little structure, roofless as it was. On quiet days its silence was deeper than elsewhere. On days of much firing the sound from within its broken walls seemed deadened, far away. Marie burned a candle as she prayed, for that soul in purgatory which she had once loved and now pitied. Sara Lee burned no candle, but she knelt, sometimes beside Marie, sometimes alone, and prayed for many things. That Henri should be living, somewhere. That the war might end. that day there would be little wounding, that some day the Belgians might go home again, and that back in America Harvey might grow to understand and forgive her. And now and then she looked into the very depths of her soul, and on those days she prayed that her homeland might, before it was too late, see this thing as she was seeing it. The wanton waste of it all, the ghastly cruelty the Germans had brought into this war. Sara Lee's vague thinking began to crystallize. This war was not a judgment sent from on high to a sinful world. It was the wicked imposition of one nation on other nations. It was national. It was almost racial. But most of all it was a war of hate on the German side. She had never believed in hate. There were ugly passions in the world, jealousy, envy, suspicion, but not hate. The word was not in her rather limited vocabulary. There was no hate on the part of the men she knew. The officers who stopped in on their way to and from the trenches were gentlemen and soldiers. They were determined and grave. They resented, they even loathed, but they did not hate. The little Belgian soldiers were bewildered, puzzled, desperately resentful, but of hate, as translated into terms of frightfulness, they had no understanding. Yet from the other side were coming methods of war so wantonly cruel, so useless save as inflicting needless agony, as only hate could devise. No strategic value justified them. They were spontaneous outgrowths of venom, nursed during the winter deadlock and now grown to full size and destructive power. The rumor of a gas that seared and killed came to the little house as early as February. In March there came the first victims, poor writhing creatures, deprived of the boon of air, their seared lungs collapsed and agonized, their faces drawn into masks of suffering. Some of them died in the little house, and even after death their faces held the imprint of horror. To Sara Lee, burying her own anxiety under the cloak of service, there came new and terrible thoughts. This was not war. The Germans had sent their clouds of poisoned gas across the inundation, but had made no attempt to follow. This was killing, for the lust of killing, suffering, for the joy of inflicting pain. And a day or so later she heard of the Hague Convention. She had not known of it before. Now she learned of that gentleman's agreement among nations, and that it said, "The use of poison or of poisoned weapons is forbidden." She pondered that carefully, trying to think dispassionately. Now and then she received a copy of a home newspaper, and she saw that the use of poison gases was being denied by Germans in America and set down to rumor and hysteria. So, on a cold spring day, she sat down at the table in the salle à manger and wrote a letter to the President, beginning, "Dear Sir," and telling what she knew of poison gas. She also, on second thought, wrote to one Andrew Carnegie, who had built a library in her city. She felt that the expense to him of sending someone over to investigate would not be prohibitive, and something must be done. She never heard from either of her letters, but she felt better for having written them. And a day or two later she received from Mrs. Travers, in England, a small supply of the first gas masks of the war. Simple and primitive they were, those first masks. Useless, too, as it turned out. A square of folded gauze soaked in some solution and then dried, with tapes to tie it over the mouth and nose. To adjust them the soldiers had but to stoop and wet them in the ever-present water in the trench, and then to tie them on. Sara Lee gave them out that night, and there was much mirth in the little house, such mirth as there had not been since Henri went away. The Belgians called it a bal masque, and putting them on bowed before one another and requested dances, and even flirted coyly with each other over their bits of white gauze. And in the very middle of the gaiety someone propounded one of Henri's idiotic riddles, and Sara Lee went across to her little room and closed the door and stood there with her eyes shut, for fear she would scream. Then, one day, coming out of the little church, she saw the low, broken gray car turn in at the top of the street and come slowly, so very slowly, toward her. There were 2 men in it. One was Henri. She ran, stumbling because of tears, up this street. It was Henri. There was no mistake. There he sat beside Jean, brushed and very neat, and very, very white. "Mademoiselle," he said, and came very close to crying himself when he saw her face. He was greatly excited. His sunken eyes devoured her as she ran toward him. Almost he held out his arms, but he could not do that, even if he would, for one was bandaged to his side. It was rather sad to record how many times Sara Lee wept during her amazing interlude, for here is another time. She wept for joy and wretchedness. She stood on the running board and cried and smiled, and Jean winked his one eye rapidly. "This idiot, mademoiselle," he said gruffly. "This maniac. He would not remain in Calais with proper care. He must come here, and rapidly. Could he have taken the wheel from me we should have been here an hour ago. But for once I have an advantage." The car jolted to the little house, and Jean helped Henri out. Such a strange Henri, smiling and joyous, and walking at a crawl, even with Jean's support. He protested violently against being put to bed, and when he found himself led into Sara Lee's small room he openly rebelled. "Never!" he said stubbornly, halting at the doorway. "This is mademoiselle's boudoir. Her drawing room as well. I am going to the mill house and—" He staggered. So Sara Lee's room had a different occupant for a time, a thin and fine-worn young Belgian, who yielded to Sara Lee when Jean gave up in despair, and who proceeded, most unmanfully, to faint as soon as he was between the blankets. If Sara Lee hoped to nurse Henri she was doomed to disappointment. Jean it was who took over the care of the boy, a Jean who now ate prodigiously, and whistled occasionally, and slept at night robed in his blanket on the floor beside Henri's bed, lest that rebellious invalid get up and try to move about. On the first night, with the door closed, against Henri's entreaties, while the little house received its evening complement of men, and with Henri lying back on his pillows, fresh dressed as to the wounds in his arm and chest, fed with Sara Lee's daintiest, and resting, Jean found the boy's eyes resting on the mantel. "Dear and obstinate friend," said Henri, "do you wish me to be happy?" "You shall not leave the room or your bed. That is arranged for." "How?" demanded Henri with interest. "Because I have hidden away your trousers." Henri laughed, but he sobered quickly. "If you wish me to be happy," he said, "take away that American photograph. But first, please bring it here." Jean brought it, holding it gingerly between his thumb and forefinger, and Henri laid back and studied it. "It is mademoiselle's fiancé," he said. "Humph!" Jean grunted. "Look at it, Jean," Henri said in his half-bantering tone, with despair beneath it. "And then look at me. Or no, remembering me as I was when I was a man. Is he better? Eh? It is a good face. But there is a jaw, and... Do you think he will be kind to her as she requires? She requires much kindness. Some women..." He broke off and watched Jean anxiously. "A half-face," Jean said scornfully. "The pretty view. As for kindness..." He put the photograph down on the table. "I knew once a man in Belgium who married an American. At Antwerp. They were most unhappy." Henri smiled. "You are lying," he said with boyish pleasure in his own astuteness. "You knew no such couple. You are trying to make me resigned." But quite a while later, when Jean thought he was asleep, he said, "I shall never be resigned." So at last spring had come, and Henri and the great spring drive. The Germans had not drained the inundation, nor had they broken through at Calais, and it is not to be known here how much this utter failure had been due to the information Henri had secured before he was wounded. One day in his bed Henri received a visit from the King, and was left lying with a decoration on his breast, and a beatific, if somewhat sheepish, expression on his face. And one night the village was bombarded, and on Henri's refusing to be moved to the cellar, Sara Lee took up a determined stand in his doorway, until at last he made a most humiliating move for safety. Bit by bit Sara Lee got the story, its bare detail from Henri, its courage and sheer recklessness from Jean. It would, for instance, run like this, with Henri in a chair perhaps and cutting dressings, since that might be done with one hand, and Sara Lee, sleeves rolled up, in a great bowl of vegetables before her. "And when you went through the water, Henri," she would ask, "what then?" "It was quite simple. They had put up some additional wire, however—" "Where?" There was a break, he would explain. I have told you, between their trenches. I had used it before to get through." "But how could you get through?" "Like a snake," he would say, smiling. "Very flat and wriggling. I have eaten of the dirt, mademoiselle." Then he would stop and cut very awkwardly with his left hand. "Go on," she would prompt him. "But they had put barbed wire there. Is that it? So you could not get through?" "With tin cans on it, and stones in the cans. I thought I had removed them all, but there was one left. So they heard me." More cutting and a muttered French expletive. Henri was not a particularly patient cripple. And apparently there was an end to the story. "For goodness' sake!" Sara Lee would exclaim despairingly. "So they heard you. That isn't all, is it?" "It was almost all," he would say with his boyish smile. "And they shot at you?" "Even better. They shot me. That was this one." And he would point to his arm. More silence, more cutting, a gathering exasperation on Sara Lee's part. "Are you going on or not?" "Then I pretended to be one of them, mademoiselle. I speak German as French. I pretended not to be hurt, but to be on a reconnaissance. And I got into the trench and we had a talk in the darkness. It was most interesting. Only if they had shown a light they would have seen that I was wounded." By bits, not that day, but after many days, she got the story. In the next trench he slipped a sling over the wounded area, and, as a Bavarian on his way to the dressing station, got back. "I had some trouble," he confessed one day. "Now and then one would offer to go back with me, and I did not care for assistance." But some time later there was trouble. She was 4 days getting to that part of it. He had got behind the lines by that time, and knew that in some way suspicion had been roused. He was weak by that time and could not go far. He had lain hidden, for a day and part of a night, without water, in a destroyed barn, and then had escaped. He got into the Belgian costume as before, but he could not wear a sling for his wounded arm. He got the peasant to thrust his helpless right hand into his pocket, and for 2 days he made a close inspection of what was going on. But fever had developed, and on the 3rd night, half delirious, when he was spoken to by an officer he had replied, of all tongues, in English. The officer shot him instantly in the chest. He fell and lay still, and the officer bent over him. In that moment Henri stabbed him with a knife in his left hand. Men were coming from every direction, but he got away. He did not clearly remember how. And at dawn he fell into the Belgian farmhouse, apparently dying. Jean's story, on the other hand, was given early and with no hesitation. He had crossed the border at Holland in civilian clothes, by the simple expedient of bribing a sentry. He had got, with little difficulty, to the farmhouse and found Henri, now recovering but very weak. He was lying hidden in a garret, and he was suffering from hunger and a lack of medical attention. In a wagon full of market stuff, Henri hidden in the bed of it, they had got to the border again. And there Jean had, it seemed, stabbed the sentry he had bribed before, and driven on to neutral soil. Not an unusual story, that of Henri and Jean. The journey across Belgium in the springless farm wagon was the worst. They had to take roundabout lanes, avoiding the main highways. Fortunately, always at night there were friendly houses, kind hands to lift Henri to the warm fire-lighted interiors. Many messages they had brought back, some of cheer, but too often of tragedy, from the small farmsteads of Belgium. Then finally had been Holland, and the chartering of a boat, and at last, "Here we are, and here we are, and here we are again," sang Henri, chopping at his cotton and making a great show of cheerfulness before Sara Lee. But with Jean sometimes he showed the black depression beneath. He would never be a man again. He was done for. He gained strength so slowly that he believed he was not gaining at all. He was not happy, and the unhappy mend slowly. After the time he had asked Jean to take away Harvey's photograph, he did not recur to the subject, but he did not need to. Jean knew, perhaps even better than Henri himself, that the boy was recklessly, hopelessly, not quite rationally in love with the American girl. Also Henri was fretting about his work. Sometimes at night, following Henri's instructions, Jean wandered quietly along roads and paths that paralleled the front. At such times his eyes were turned, not toward the trenches, but toward that flat country which lay behind, still dotted at that time with groves of trees, with canals overhung with pollard willows, and here and there a farmhouse that at night took on in the starlight the appearance of being whole again. Singularly white and peaceful were those small steadings of Belgium in the night hours, until cruel dawn showed them for what they were, skeletons of dead homes, clothed only at night with wraith-like roofs and chimneys. Ghosts of houses, appearing between midnight and cock-crow. Jean had not Henri's eyes, nor his recklessness, nor his speed, for that matter. Now and then he saw the small appearing and disappearing of lights on some small rise. He would reach the spot, with such shelter as possible, only to find a sugar beet field neglected and unplowed. Then, one night, tragedy came to the little house of mercy. Harvey proceeded to put his plan into effect at once, with the simple method of an essentially simple nature. The thing had become intolerable, therefore it must end. On the afternoon following his talk with Belle, he came home at 3 o'clock. Belle heard him moving about in his room, and when she entered it, after he had gone, she found that he had shaved and put on his best suit. She smiled a little. It was like Harvey to be literal. He had said he was going to go round and have a good time, and he was losing no time. But in their restricted social life, where most of the men worked until 5 o'clock or even later, there were few afternoon calls paid. Belle wondered with mild sisterly curiosity into what arena Harvey was about to fling his best hat. But though Harvey paid a call that afternoon, it was not on any of the young women he knew. He went to see Mrs. Gregory. She was at home. He had arranged for that by telephone. And the one butler of the neighborhood admitted him. It was a truculent young man, for all his politeness, who confronted Mrs. Gregory in her drawing-room. A quietly truculent young man, who came to the point while he was still shaking hands. "You're not going to be glad to see me in a minute," he said, replying to her greeting. "But how can you know that?" "Because I've come to get you to do something you won't want to do." "We won't quarrel before we begin, then," she said pleasantly, "because I really never do anything I don't wish to do." But she gave him a second glance, and her smile became a trifle forced. She knew all about Harvey and Sara Lee. She had heard rumors of his disapproval also. Though she was not a clever nor a very keen woman, she saw what was coming and braced herself for it. Harvey had prepared in his mind a summary of his position, and he delivered it with the rapidity and strength of a blow. "I know all about the Belgians, Mrs. Gregory," he said. "I'm sorry for them. So is everyone, I suppose. But I want to know if you think a girl of 20 ought to be over there practically at the front, and alone." He gave her time to reply. "Would you like to have one of your daughters there, if you had one?" "Perhaps not, under ordinary circumstances. But this is war." "It is not our war." "Humanity," said Mrs. Gregory, remembering the phrase she had written for a speech. "Humanity has no nationality. It's of all men, for all men." "That's men, not women." He got up and stood on the hearthrug. He was singularly reminiscent of the time he had stood on Aunt Harriet's white fur rug and had told Sara Lee she could not go. "Now see here, Mrs. Gregory," he said. "We'll stop beating about the bush, if you don't mind. She's got to come home. She's coming, if I have to go and get her." "You needn't look at me so fiercely. I didn't send her. It was her own idea." Harvey sneered. "No," he said. "But I notice your society publishes her reports in the papers, and that the names of the officers are rarely missing." Mrs. Gregory colored. "We must have publicity to get money," she said. "It is hard to get. Sometimes I have to make up the deficit out of my own pocket." "Then for God's sake bring her home. If the thing has to go on, send over there some of the middle-aged women who have no ties. Let 'em get shot at if they want to. They can write as good reports as she can, if that's all you want. And make as good soup," he added bitterly. "It could be done, of course," she said thoughtfully. "But I must tell you this. I doubt if an older woman could have got where she has. There is no doubt that her charm, her youth and beauty have helped her greatly. We cannot—" The very whites of his eyes turned red then. He shouted furiously that for their silly work and their love of publicity they were trading on a young girl's youth and beauty. That if anything happened to her he would publish the truth in every newspaper in the country. That they would at once recall Sara Lee, or he would placard the city with what they were doing. These were only a few of the things he threw at her. When he was out of breath he jerked the picture of the little house of mercy out of his pocket and flung it into her lap. "There," he said. "Do you know where that house is? It's in a ruined village. She hasn't said that, has she? Well, look at the masonry there. That's a shell hole in the street. That soldier's got a gun. Why? Because the Germans may march up that street any day on their way to Calais." Mrs. Gregory looked at the picture. Sara Lee smiled into the sun. And René, ignorant that his single rifle was to oppose the march of the German army to Calais, René smiled also. Mrs. Gregory rose. "I shall report your view to the society," she said coldly. "I understand how you feel, but I fail to see the reason for this attack on me." "I guess you see all right," he flung at her. "She's my future wife. If you hadn't put this nonsense into her head we'd be married by now, and she'd be here in God's country, and not living with a lot of foreigners who don't know a good woman when they see one. I want her back, that's all. But I want her back safe. If anything happens to her, I'll make you pay. You and all your notoriety hunters." He went out then, and was for leaving without his hat or coat, but the butler caught him at the door. Out in the spring sunlight he walked rapidly, still seething, remembering other bitter things he had meant to say, and repeating them to himself. But he had said enough. Mrs. Gregory's account of his visit she reported at a meeting specially called. The narrative lost nothing in the repetition, but the kindly women who sat in the church house sewing or knitting listened to what Harvey had said and looked troubled. They liked Sara Lee, and many of them had daughters of their own. The photograph was passed around. Undoubtedly Sara Lee was living in a ruined village. Certainly ruined villages were only found very near the front. And René unquestionably held a gun. Tales of German brutalities to women had come and were coming constantly to their ears. Mabel Andrews had written to them for supplies, and she had added to the chapter of horrors. Briefly, the sense of the meeting was that Harvey had been brutal, but that he was right. An older woman in a safe place they might continue to support, but none of them would assume the responsibility of the crushing out of a young girl's life. To be quite frank, possibly Harvey's appeal would have carried less weight had it not coincided with Sara Lee's request for more money. Neither one alone would have brought about the catastrophe, but all together they made question and answer, problem and solution. Money was scarce, demands were heavy. None of them except Mrs. Gregory had more than just enough, and there was this additional situation to face. There was no end to the war in sight. It gave promise now of going on indefinitely. Joffre had said, "I nibble them." But to nibble a hole in the German army might take years. They had sent Sara Lee for a few months. How about keeping her there indefinitely? Oddly enough, it was Harvey's sister Belle who made the only protest against the recall. "Of course, I want her back," she said slowly. "You'd understand better if you had to live with Harvey. I'm sorry, Mrs. Gregory, that he spoke to you as he did, but he's nearly crazy." She eyed the assembly with her tired, shrewd eyes. "I'm no talker," she went on, "but Sara Lee has done a big thing. We don't realize, I guess, how big it is, and I think we'll just about kill her if we bring her home." "Better to do that than to have her killed over there," someone said. And in spite of Belle's protest, that remained the sense of the meeting. It was put to the vote and decided to recall Sara Lee. She could bring a report of conditions, and if she thought it wise an older woman could go later, to a safer place. Belle was very quiet that evening. After dinner she went to Harvey's room and found him dressing to go out. "I'm going with a crowd to the theater," he said. "First week of the summer stock company, you know." He tied his tie defiantly, avoiding Belle's eyes in the mirror. "Harvey," she said, "they're going to bring Sara Lee home." He said nothing, but his hand shook somewhat. "And I think," Belle said, "that you will be sorry for what you have done, all the rest of your life." By the time Henri was well enough to resume his former activities, it was almost the 1st of May. The winter quiet was over with a vengeance, and the Allies were hammering hard with their first tolerably full supply of high explosive shells. Cheering reports came daily to the little house, of rapidly augmenting armies, of big guns on caterpillar trucks that were moving slowly up to the Allied front. Great Britain had at last learned her lesson, that only shells of immense destructiveness were of any avail against the German batteries. She was moving heaven and earth to get them, but the supply was still inadequate. With the new shells experiments were being made in barrage fire, costly experiments now and then, but the Allies were apt in learning the ugly game of modern war. Only on the Belgian front was there small change. The shattered army was being freshly outfitted. England was sending money and ammunition, and on the sand dunes small bodies of fresh troops drilled and smiled grimly and drilled again. But there were not, as in England and in France, great bodies of young men to draw from. Too many had been caught beyond the German wall of steel. Yet a wave of renewed courage had come with the sun and the green fields, and conditions had improved for the Belgians in other ways. They were being paid, for one thing, with something like regularity. Food was better and more plentiful. One day Henri appeared at the top of the street and drove down triumphantly a small unclipped horse, which trundled behind it a vertical boiler on wheels with a firebox and stovepipe. "A portable kitchen," he explained. "See, here for soup and here for coffee. And more are coming." "Very soon, Henri, they will not need me," Sara Lee said wistfully. But he protested almost violently. He even put the question to the horse, and blowing in his ear made him shake his head in the negative. She was needed indeed. To the great base hospital at La Panne went more and more wounded men. But to the little house of mercy came the small odds and ends in increasing numbers. Medical men were scarce and badly overworked. There was talk, for a time, of sending a surgeon to the little house, but it came to nothing. La Panne was not far away, and all the surgeons they could get there were not too many. So the little house went on much as before. Henri had moved to the mill. He was at work again, and one day, in the King's villa and quietly, because of many reasons, Henri, a very white and erect Henri, received a second medal, the highest for courage that could be given. He did not tell Sara Lee. But though he and the men who served under him worked hard, they could not always perform miracles. The German planes still outnumbered the Allied ones. They had grown more daring with the spring, too, and whatever Henri might learn of ground operations, he could not foretell those of the air. On a moonlight night early in May Sara Lee, setting out her dressings, heard a man running up the street. René challenged him sharply, only to step aside. It was Henri. He burst in on Sara Lee. "To the cellar, mademoiselle," he said. "A bombardment?" asked Sara Lee. "From the air. They may pass over, but there are 12 Taubes, and they are circling overhead." The first bomb dropped then in the street. It was white moonlight, and the Germans must have seen that there were no troops. Probably it was as Henri said later, that they had learned of the little house, and since it brought such aid and comfort as might be, it was to be destroyed. The house of the mill went with the second bomb. Then followed a deafening uproar as plane after plane dropped its shells on the dead town. Marie and Sara Lee were in the cellar by that time, but the cellar was scarcely safer than the floor above. From a bombardment by shells from guns miles away there was protection. But from a bomb dropped from the sky the floors above were practically useless. Only Henri and René remained on the street floor. Henri was extinguishing lights. In the passage René stood, not willing to take refuge until Henri, whom he adored, had done so. For a moment the uproar ceased, and in a spirit of bravado René stepped out into the moonlight and made a gesture of derision into the air. He fell there, struck by a piece of splintered shell. "Come, René!" Henri called. "The brave are those who live to fight again, not—" But René's figure against the moonlight was gone. Henri ran to the doorway then, and found him lying, his head on the little step where he had been wont to sit and whittle and sing his Tipperary. He was dead. Henri carried him in and laid him in the little passage very reverently. Then he went below. "Where's René?" Sara Lee asked from the darkness. "A foolish boy," said Henri, a catch in his throat. "He is, I think, watching these fiends of the air from some shelter." "There is no shelter," shivered the girl. He groped for her hand in the darkness, and so they stood, hand in hand, like two children, waiting for what might come. It was not until the thing was over that he told her. He had gone up first, and so that she would not happen on his silent figure unwarned, had carried René to the open upper floor, where he lay, singularly peaceful, face up to the awful beauty of the night. "Good night, little brother," Henri said to him, and left him there with a heavy heart. Never again would René sit and whittle on the doorstep and sing his tuneless Tipperary. Never again would he gaze with boyish, adoring eyes at Sara Lee as she moved back and forth in the little house. Henri stared up at the sky. The moon looked down, cold and cruelly bright, on the vanishing squadron of death, on the destroyed town, and on the boy's white face. Somewhere, Henri felt, vanishing like the German Taubes, but to peace instead of war, was moving René's brave and smiling spirit. A boyish angel, eager and dauntless, and still looking up. Henri took off his cap and crossed himself. Another sentry took René's place the next day, but the little house had lost something it could not regain, and a greater loss was to come. Jean brought out the mail that day. For Sara Lee, moving about silent and red-eyed, there was a letter from Mr. Travers. He enclosed £100 and a clipping from a London newspaper entitled "The Little House of Mercy." "Evidently," he wrote, "you were right and we were wrong. One half of the enclosed cheque is from my wife, who takes this method of showing her affectionate gratitude. The balance is from myself. Once, some months ago, I said to you that almost you restored my faith in human nature. To-day may I say that, in these hours of sorrow for us all, what you have been doing and are doing has brought to my gray day a breath of hope." There was another clipping, but no comment. It recorded the death of a Reginald Alexander Travers, aged 30. It was then that Sara Lee, who was by way of thinking for herself those days, and of thinking clearly, recognized the strange, new self-abnegation of the English, their attitude not so much of suppressing their private griefs as of refusing to obtrude them. A strongly individualistic people, they were already commencing to think nationally. Grief was a private matter, to be borne privately. To the world they must present an unbroken front, an unshaken and unshatterable faith. A new attitude, and a strange one, for grumbling, crotchety, gouty-souled England. A people who had for centuries insisted not only on its rights but on its privileges, was now giving as freely as ever it had demanded. It was now as though, having hoarded all these years, it had been but hoarding against the day of payment. As it had received it gave, in money, in effort, in life, and without pretext. So the Traverses, having given up all that made life for them, sent a clipping only, and no comment. Sara Lee, through a mist of tears, saw them alone in their drawing-room, having tea as usual, and valiantly speaking of small things, and bravely facing the future, but never, in the bitterest moments, making complaint or protest. Would America, she wondered, if her hour came, be so brave? Harvey had a phrase for such things. It was "stand the gaff." Would America stand the gaff so well? Courage was America's watchword, but a courage of the body rather than of the soul. Physical courage, not moral. What would happen if America entered the struggle and the papers were filled, as were the British and the French, with long casualty lists, each name a knife thrust somewhere? She wondered. And then, before long, it was Sara Lee's turn to stand the gaff. There was another letter, a curiously incoherent one, from Harvey's sister. She referred to something that the society had done, and hoped that Sara Lee would take it in kindness, as it was meant. Harvey was well and much happier. She was to try to understand Harvey's part. He had been almost desperate. Evidently the letter had preceded the one that should have arrived at the same time. Sara Lee was sadly puzzled. She went to Henri with it, but he could make nothing out of it. There was nothing to do but to wait. The next night Henri was to go through the lines again. Since his wounding he had been working on the Allied side, and fewer lights there were in his district that flashed the treacherous message across the flood, between night and morning. But now it was imperative that he go through the German lines again. It was feared that with mighty grappling hooks the enemy was slowly and cautiously withdrawing the barbed wire from the inundated fields, and that could mean but one thing. On the night he was to go Henri called Sara Lee from the crowded salle à manger, and drawing her into the room across closed the door. "Mademoiselle," he said gravely, "once before, long ago, you permitted me to kiss you. Will you do that for me again?" She kissed him at once, gravely. Once she would have flushed. She did not now. For there was a change in Sara Lee as well as in her outlook. She had been seeing for months the shortness of life, the brief tenure men held on it, the value of such happiness as might be for the hours that remained. She was a woman now, for all her slim young body and her charm of youth. Values had changed. To love, and to show that love, to cheer, to comfort and help, that was necessary, because soon the chance might be gone, and there would be long aching years of regret. She kissed him gravely and looked up into his eyes, her own full of tears. "God bless and keep you, dear Henri," she said. Then she went back to her work. Much of Sara Lee's life at home had faded. She seemed to be two people. One was the girl who had knitted the afghan for Anna, and had hidden it away from Uncle James's kind but curious eyes. And one was this present Sara Lee, living on the edge of eternity, and seeing men die or suffer horribly, not to gain anything, except perhaps some honorable advancement for their souls, but that there might be preserved, at any cost, the right of honest folk to labor in their fields, to love, to pray, and at last to sleep in the peace of God. She had lost the past, and she dared not look into the future. She was living each day as it came, with its labor, its love, its prayers, and at last its sleep. Even Harvey seemed remote and stern and bitter. She reread his letters often, but they were forced. And after a time she realized another quality in them. They were self-centered. It was his anxiety, his loneliness, his humiliation. Sara Lee's eyes were looking out those days over a suffering world. Harvey's eyes were turned in on himself. She realized this but never formulated it, even to herself. What she did acknowledge was a growing fear of the reunion which must come sometime, that he was cherishing still further bitterness against that day, that he would say things that he would regret later. Sometimes the thought of that day came to her when she was doing a dressing, and her hands would tremble. Henri had not returned when, the second day after René's death, the letter came which recalled her. She opened it eagerly. Though from Harvey there usually came at the best veiled reproach, the society had always sent its enthusiastic approval. She read it twice before she understood, and it was only when she read Belle's letter again that she began to comprehend. She was recalled, and the recall was Harvey's work. She was very close to hating him that day. He had never understood. She would go back to him as she had promised. But always, all the rest of their lives, there would be this barrier between them. To the barrier of his bitterness would be added her own resentment. She could never even talk to him of her work, of those great days when in her small way she had felt herself a part of the machinery of mercy of the war. Harvey had lost something out of Sara Lee's love for him. He had done it himself, madly, despairingly. She still loved him, she felt. Nothing could change that or her promise to him. But with that love there was something now of fear. And she felt, too, that after all the years she had known him she had not known him at all. The Harvey she had known was a tender and considerate man, soft-spoken, slow to wrath, always gentle. But the Harvey of his letters and of the recall was a stranger. It was the result of her upbringing, probably, that she had no thought of revolt. Her tie to Harvey was a real tie. By her promise to him her life was no longer hers to order. It belonged to someone else, to be ordered for her. But, though she accepted, she was too clear a thinker not to resent. When Henri returned, toward the dawn of the following night, he did not come alone. Sara Lee, rising early, found two men in her kitchen, one of them Henri, who was making coffee, and a soldier in a gray-green uniform, with a bad bruise over one eye and a sulky face. His hands were tied, but otherwise he sat at ease, and Henri, having made the coffee, held a cup to his lips. "It is good for the spirits, man," he said in German. "Drink it." The German took it, first gingerly, then eagerly. Henri was in high good humor. "See, I have brought you a gift," he exclaimed on seeing Sara Lee. "What shall we do with him? Send him to America, to show the appearance of the madmen of Europe?" The prisoner was only a boy, such a boy as Henri himself, but a peasant and muscular. Beside his bulk Henri looked slim as a reed. Henri eyed him with a certain tolerant humor. "He is young and a Bavarian," he said. "Otherwise I should have killed him, for he fought hard. But he has just been called." There was another conference in the little house that morning, but Henri's prisoner could tell little. He had heard nothing of an advance. Further along the line it was said that there was much fighting. He sat there, pale and bewildered and very civil, and in the end his frightened politeness brought about a change in the attitude of the men who questioned him. Hate all Germans as they must, who had suffered so grossly, this boy was not of those who had outraged them. They sent him on at last, and Sara Lee was free to tell Henri her news. But she had grown very wise as to Henri's moods, and she hesitated. A certain dissatisfaction had been growing in the boy for some time, a sense of hopelessness. Further along the spring had brought renewed activity to the Allied armies. Great movements were taking place. But his own men stood in their trenches, or what passed for trenches, or lay on their hours of relief in such wretched quarters as could be found, still with no prospect of action. No great guns, drawn by heavy tractors, came down the roads toward the trenches by the sea. Steady bombarding, incessant sniping, and no movement on either side, that was the Belgian front during the first year of the war. Inaction, with that eating anxiety as to what was going on in the occupied territory, was the portion of the heroic small army that stretched from Nieuport to Dixmude. And Henri's nerves were not good. He was unhappy, that always, and he was not yet quite recovered from his wounds. There was on his mind, too, a certain gun which moved on a railway track, back and forth, behind the German lines, doing the work of many. He had tried to get to that gun and failed, and he hated failure. Certainly in this story of Sara Lee and Henri, whose other name must not be known, allowance must be made for all those things. Yet, perhaps no allowance is enough. Sara Lee told him that evening of her recall, told him when the shuffling of many feet in the street told of the first weary men from the trenches coming up the road. He heard her in a dazed silence. Then, "But you will not go," he said. "It is impossible. You are needed, mademoiselle." "What can I do, Henri? They have recalled me. My money will not come now." "Perhaps we can arrange that. It does not cost so much. I have friends. And think, mademoiselle, how many now know of what you are doing and love you for it. Some of them would contribute, surely." He was desperately revolving expedients in his mind. He could himself do no more than he had done. He, or rather Jean and he together, had been bearing a full half of the expense of the little house since the beginning. But he dared not tell her that. And though he spoke hopefully, he knew well that he could raise nothing from the Belgians he knew best. Henri came of a class that held its fortunes in land, and that land was now in German hands. "We will arrange it somehow," he said with forced cheerfulness. "No beautiful thing, and this is surely beautiful, must die because of money." It was then that Sara Lee took the plunge. "It is not only money, Henri." "He has sent for you?" Harvey was always he to Henri. "Not exactly. But I think he went to someone and said I should not be here alone. You can understand how he feels. We were going to be married very soon, and then I decided to come. It made an awful upset." Henri stood with folded arms and listened. At first he said nothing. When he spoke it was in a voice of ominous calm. "So for a stupid convention he would destroy this beautiful thing you have made. Does he know your work? Does he know what you are to the men here? Have you ever told him?" "I have, of course, but—" "Do you want to go back?" "No, Henri, not yet. I—" "That is enough. You are needed. You are willing to stay. I shall attend to the money. It is arranged." "You don't understand," said Sara Lee desperately. "I am engaged to him. I can't wreck his life, can I?" "Would it wreck your life?" he demanded. "Tell me that, and I shall know how to reason with you." But she only looked at him helplessly. Heavy tramping in the passage told of the arrival of the first men. They did not talk and laugh as usual. As well as they could they came quietly, for René had been a good friend to many of them, and had admitted on slack nights many a weary man who had no ticket. Much as the neighbors had entered the house back home after Uncle James had gone away, came these bearded men that night, and Sara Lee, hearing their muffled voices, brushed a hand over her eyes and tried to smile. "We can talk about it later," she said. "We mustn't quarrel. I owe so much to you, Henri." Suddenly Henri caught her by the arm and turned her about so that she faced the lamp. "Do you love him?" he demanded. "Sara Lee, look at me." Only he pronounced it Sara Lee. "He has done a very cruel thing. Do you still love him?" Sara Lee shut her eyes. "I don't know. I think I do. He is very unhappy, and it is my fault." "Your fault?" "I must go, Henri. The men are waiting." But still he held her arm. "Does he love you as I love you?" he demanded. "Would he die for you?" "It's rather silly, isn't it? Men don't die for the people they love." "I would die for you, Sara Lee." She eyed him rather helplessly. "I don't think you mean that." Bad strategy that, for he drew her to him. His arms were like steel, and it was a rebellious and very rigid Sara Lee who found she could not free herself. "I would die for you, Sara Lee," he repeated fiercely. "That would be easier, far, than living without you. There is nothing that matters but you. Listen. I would put everything I have, my honor, my life, my hope of eternity, on one side of the scale and you on the other. And I would choose you. Is that love?" He freed her. "It's insanity," said Sara Lee angrily. "You don't mean it, and I don't want that kind of love, if that is what you call it." "And you will go back to that man who loves himself better than he loves you?" "That's not true," she flashed at him. "He is sending for me, not to get me back to him, but to get me back to safety." "What sort of safety?" Henri demanded in an ominous tone. "Is he afraid of me?" "He doesn't know anything about you." "You have never told him? Why?" His eyes narrowed. "He wouldn't have understood, Henri." "You are going back to him," he said slowly. "And you will always keep these days of ours buried in your heart. Is that it?" His eyes softened. "I am to be a memory. Do you know what I think? I think you care for me more than you know. We have lived a lifetime together in these months. You know me better than you know him, already. We have faced death together. That is a strong tie. And I have held you in my arms. Do you think you can forget that?" "I shall never want to forget you." "I shall never let you forget me. You may go. I cannot prevent that, perhaps. But wherever I am, Sara Lee, I shall stand between that lover of yours and you. And sometime I shall come from this other side of the world, and I shall find you, and you will come back with me. Back to this country. Our country." They were boyish words, but back of them was the iron determination of a man. His eyes seemed sunken in his head. His face was white. But there was almost a prophetic ring in his voice. Sara Lee went out and left him there. Went out rather terrified and bewildered, and refusing absolutely to look into her own heart. Late in May she started for home. It had not been necessary to close the little house. An Englishwoman of mature years and considerable wealth, hearing from Mr. Travers of Sara Lee's recall, went out a day or two before she left and took charge. She was a kindly woman, in deep mourning, and some of the ache left Sara Lee's heart when she talked with her successor. Perhaps, too, Mrs. Cameron understood some of the things that had puzzled her before. She had been a trifle skeptical, perhaps, about Sara Lee, before she saw her. A young girl alone among an army of men. She was a good woman herself, and not given to harsh judgments, but the thing had seemed odd. But Sara Lee in her little house, as virginal, as without sex consciousness as a child, Sara Lee with her shabby clothes and her stained hands and honest eyes. This was not only a good girl, this was a brave and high-spirited and idealistic woman. And after an evening in the house of mercy, with the soldiers openly adoring and entirely respectful, Mrs. Cameron put her arms round Sara Lee and kissed her. "You must let me thank you," she said. "You have made me feel what I have not felt since—" She stopped. Her mourning was only a month old. "I see tonight, after all, many things may be gone, but that while service remains there is something worth while in life." The next day she asked Sara Lee to stay with her, at least through the summer. Sara Lee hesitated, but at last she agreed to cable. As Henri had disappeared with the arrival of Mrs. Cameron, it was that lady's chauffeur who took the message to Dunkirk and sent it off. She had sent the cable to Harvey. It was no longer a matter of the lady's aid. It was between Harvey and herself. The reply came on the second day. It was curt and decisive. "Now or never," was the message Harvey sent out of his black despair, across the Atlantic to the little house so close under the guns of Belgium. Henri was half mad those last days. Jean tried to counsel him, but he was irritable, almost savage. And Jean understood. The girl had grown deep into his own heart. Like Henri, he believed that she was going back to unhappiness. He even said so to her in the car, on that last sad day when Sara Lee, having visited René's grave and prayed in the ruined church, said good-bye to the little house and went away, tearless at the last, because she was too sad for tears. It was not for some time that Jean spoke what was in his mind, and when he had done so she turned to him gravely. "You are wrong, Jean. He is the kindest of men. Once I am back, and safe, he will be very different. I'm afraid I've given you a wrong impression of him." "You think then, mademoiselle, that he will forget all these months? He will never be unhappy over them?" "Why should he?" said Sara Lee proudly. "When I tell him everything he will understand, and he will be very proud that I have done my share." But Jean's one eye was dubious. At the wharf in Dunkirk they found Henri, a pale but composed Henri. Jean's brows contracted. He had thought the boy would follow his advice and stay away. But Henri was there. It was as well, perhaps, for Sara Lee had brought him a letter, one of those missives from the trenches which had been so often left at the little house. Henri thrust it into his pocket without reading it. "Everything is prepared," he said. "It is the British Admiralty boat, and one of the officers has offered his cabin. You will be quite comfortable." He appeared entirely calm. He saw to carrying Sara Lee's small bag on board. He chatted with the officers. He even wandered over to a hospital ship moored near by and exchanged civilities with a wounded man in a chair on the deck. Perhaps he swaggered a bit too much, for Jean watched him with some anxiety. He saw that the boy was taking it hard. His eyes were very sunken now, and he moved his right arm stiffly, as though the old wound troubled him. Jean did not like leave-takings. Particularly he did not like taking leave of Sara Lee. Some time before the boat sailed he kissed her hand, and then patted it and went away in the car without looking back. The boat was preparing to get under way. Henri was standing by her very quietly. He had not slept the night before, but then there were many nights when Henri did not sleep. He had wandered about, smoking incessantly, trying to picture the black future. He could not see hope anywhere. America was far away, and peaceful. Very soon the tranquillity of it all would make the last months seem dreamlike and unreal. She would forget Belgium, forget him. Or she would remember him as a soldier who had once loved her. Once loved her, because she had never seemed to realize the lasting quality of his love. She had always felt that he would forget her. If he could only make her believe that he would not, it would not be so hopeless. He had written a bit of a love letter on the little table at Dunkirk that morning, written it with the hope that the sight of the written words might carry conviction when all his protests had failed. "I shall love you all the years of my life," he wrote. "At any time, in any place, you may come to me and know that I am waiting. Great love like this comes only once to any man, and once come to him it never goes away. At any time in the years to come you may know with certainty that you are still to me what you are now, the love of my life. Sometimes I think, dearest, I may call you that once, now that you have left me. that far away you will hear this call of mine and come back to me. Perhaps you will never come. Perhaps I shall not live. I feel today that I do not care greatly to live. If that is to be, then think of me somewhere, perhaps with Rene by my side, since he, too, loved you. And I shall still be calling you, and waiting. Perhaps even beyond the stars they have need of a little house of mercy. And God knows, wherever I am I shall have need of you." He had the letter in the pocket of his tunic, and at the last moment came when the boat must leave. Suddenly Henri knew that he could not allow her to cross to England alone. The last few days had brought many stories of submarine attacks. Here, so far north, the Germans were particularly active. They had for a long time lurked in waiting for this British Admiralty boat, with its valuable cargo, its officers and the government officials who used it. "Good bye, Henri," said Sara Lee. Of course it is no use to try to tell you—" "I am going across with you." "But—" "I allowed you to come over alone. I shiver when I think of it. I shall take you back myself." "Is it very dangerous?" "Probably not. But can you think of me standing safe on that quay and letting you go into danger alone?" "I am not afraid." "I know that. I have never seen you afraid. But if you wish to see a coward, look at me. I am a coward for you." He put his hand into his pocket. It occurred to him to give her the letter now so that if anything happened she would at least have had it. He wanted no mistake about that appointment beyond the stars. But the great world of eternity was large, and they must have a definite understanding about that meeting at the little house of mercy over there. Perhaps he had a little fever that day. He was alternately flushed and pale, and certainly he was not quite rational. His hand shook as he brought out her letter, and with it the other letter, from the front. "Have you the time to come with me?" Sara Lee asked doubtfully. "I want you to come, of course, but if your work will suffer—" He held out his letter to her. "I shall go away," he said, "while you read it. And perhaps you will not destroy it, because I should like to feel that you have it always." He went away at once, saluting as he passed other officers, who gravely saluted him. On the deck of the hospital ship the invalid touched his cap. Word was going about, in the stealthy manner of such things, that Henri, whose family name we may not know, was a brave man and doing brave things. The steamer had not yet cast off. As usual, it was to take a flying start from the harbor, for it was just outside the harbor that the wolves of the sea lay in wait. Henri, alone at last, opened his letter and stood staring at it. There was again movement behind the German line, a matter to be looked into, as only he could do it. Probably nothing, as before, but who could say? Henri looked along the shore to where but a few miles away lay the ragged remnant of his country, and he looked forward to where Sara Lee, his letter in her hand, was staring blindly at nothing. Then he looked out toward the sea, where lay who knew what dangers of death and suffering. After that first moment of indecision he never hesitated. He stood on the deck and watched, rather frozen and rigid, and with a mind that had ceased working, while the steamer warped out of the quay. If in his subconscious there was any thought, it was doubtless that he had done his best for a long time, and that he had earned the right to protect for a few hours the girl he loved. That, too, there would have been activity along the German-Belgian line before, without result. Perhaps unconsciously these things were there. He himself was conscious of no thought, of only a dogged determination to get Sara Lee across the channel safely. He put everything else behind him. In the bow, on the bridge, and at different stations, lookouts kept watch. The lifeboats were hung overboard ready to lower instantly. On the horizon a British destroyer steamed leisurely. Henri stood for a long time on the deck. The land fell away quickly. From a clear silhouette of the town against the sky, the dunes, the spire of the cathedral, the roof of the mairie, it became vague, shadowy. The height of a hand, a line, nothing. Henri roused himself. He was very thirsty and the wound in his arm ached. When he raised his hand to the salute the movement was painful. It was a very grave Sara Lee he found in the officer's cabin when he went inside later on. She was sitting on the long seat below the open port, her hat slightly askew and her hands folded in her lap. Her bag was beside her, and there was in her eyes a perplexity Henri was too wretched to notice. For the first time Sara Lee was realizing the full value of the thing she was throwing away. She had persistently discounted it until now. She had been grateful for it. She had felt unworthy of it. But now, on the edge of leaving it, she felt that something infinitely precious and very beautiful was going out of her life. She already had a sense of loss. For the first time, too, she was allowing herself to think of certain contingencies that were now forever impossible. For instance, suppose she had stayed with Mrs. Cameron? Suppose she had broken her promise to Harvey and remained at the little house? Suppose she had done as Henri had so wildly urged her and had broken entirely with Harvey? Would she have married Henri? There was a certain element of caution in the girl. It made the chances she had taken rather more courageous, indeed, because she had always counted the cost. But marriage was not a matter for taking chances. One should know not only the man, but his setting, though she would not have thought of it in that way. Not only the man, but the things that made up his life, his people, his home. And Henri was to her still a figure, not so much now of mystery as of detachment. Except Jean he had no intimates. He had no family on the only side of the line she knew. He had not even a country. She had reached that point when Henri came below and saluted her stiffly from the doorway. "Henri," she said, "I believe you are ill." "I am not ill," he said, and threw himself into the corner of the seat. "You have read it?" She nodded. Even thinking of it brought a lump to her throat. He bent forward, but he did not touch her. "I meant it, Sara Lee," he said. "Sometimes men are infatuated, and write what they do not mean. They are sincere at the time, and then later on. But I meant it. I shall always mean it." Not then, nor during the 3 days in London, did he so much as take her hand. He was not well. He ate nothing, and at night he lay awake and drank a great deal of water. Once or twice he found her looking at him anxiously, but he disclaimed all illness. He had known from the beginning what he was doing, but he did not touch her, because in his heart he knew that where once he had been worthy, he was no longer worthy. He had left his work for a woman. It is true that he had expected to go back at once, but the Philadelphia, which had been listed to sail the next day, was held up by a strike in Liverpool, and he waited on, taking such hours as she could give him, feverishly anxious to make her happy, buying her little gifts, mostly flowers, which she wore tucked in her belt and smiled over, because she had never before received flowers from a man. He was alternately gay and silent. They walked across the Thames by the Parliament buildings, and midway across he stopped and looked at the stream. And they went to the Zoological Gardens, where he gravely named one of the sea lions for Colonel Lilias because of its mustache, and insisted on saluting it each time before he flung it a fish. Once he soberly gathered up a very new baby camel, all legs, in his arms, and presented it to her. "Please accept it, mademoiselle," he said, "with my compliments." They dined together every night, very modestly, sitting in some crowded restaurant perhaps, but seeing little but each other. Sara Lee had bought a new hat in London, black, of course, but faced with white. He adored her in it. He would sit for long moments, his elbows propped on the table, his blonde hair gleaming in the candlelight, and watch her. "I wonder," he said once, "if you had never met him, would you have loved me?" "I do love you, Henri." "I don't want that sort of love." And he had turned his head away. But one evening he called for her at Morley's, a white and crushed boy, needing all that she could give him and much more. He came as a man goes to the woman he loves when he is in trouble, much as a child to his mother. Sara Lee, coming down to the reception room, found him there alone, walking rapidly up and down. He turned desperate eyes on her. "I have brought bad news," he said abruptly. "The little house?" "I do not know. I ran away, mademoiselle. I am a traitor, and the Germans broke through last night." "Henri!" "They broke through. We were not ready. That is what I have done." "Don't you think," Sara Lee said in a frozen voice, "that is what I have done? I let you come." "You? You are taking the blame? Mademoiselle, I have enough to bear without that." He explained further, still standing in his rigid attitude. If he had been white before at times, he was ghastly now. It had not been an attack in force. A small number had got across and penetrated beyond the railway line. There had been hand-to-hand fighting in the road beyond the poplars, but it looked more like an experiment, an endeavor to discover the possibility of a real advance through the inundation, or perhaps a feint to cover operations elsewhere. "For every life lost, I am responsible," he ended in a flat and lifeless tone. "But you might not have known," she protested wildly. "Even if you had been there, Henri, you might not have known." She knew something of war by that time. "How could you have told that a small movement of troops was to take place?" "I should have been there." "But if they came without warning—" "I did not tell you," he said, looking away from her. "There had been a warning. I disregarded it." He went back to Belgium that night. Sara Lee, at last, held out her hand. She was terrified for him, and she showed it. "I shall not touch your hand," he said. "I have forfeited my right to do that." Then, seeing what was in her face, he reassured her. "I shall not do that," he said. "It would be easier, but I shall have to go back and see what can be done." He was the old Henri to the last, however. He went carefully over her steamship ticket and inquired with equal care into the amount of money she had. "It will take you home?" he asked. "Very comfortably, Henri." "It seems very little." Then he said, apropos of nothing, "Poor Jean." When he left her at last he went to the door very erect and soldierly. But he turned there and stood for a moment looking at her, as though through all that was coming he must have with him, to give him strength, that final picture of her. The elderly chambermaid, coming into Sara Lee's room the next morning, found her fully dressed in the frock she had worn the night before, face down on her bed. It was early June when at last the lights went down behind the back drop and came up in front, to show Sara Lee knitting again, though not by the fire. The amazing interlude was over. Over, except in Sara Lee's heart. The voyage had been a nightmare. She had been ill for one thing, a combination of seasickness and heart sickness. She had allowed Henri to come to England with her, and the Germans had broken through. All the good she had done, and she had helped, was nothing to this mischief she had wrought. It had been a small raid, she gathered that from the papers on board. But that was not the vital thing. What mattered was that she had let a man forget his duty to his country in his solicitude for her. But as the days went on the excitement of her return dulled the edge of her misery somewhat. The thing was done. She could do only one thing to help. She would never go back, never again bring trouble and suffering where she had meant only to bring aid and comfort. She had a faint hope that Harvey would meet her at the pier. She needed comforting and soothing, and perhaps a bit of praise. She was so very tired. Depressed, too, if the truth be known. She needed a hand to lead her back to her old place on the stage, and kind faces to make her forget that she had ever gone away. Because that was what she had to do. She must forget Henri and the little house on the road to the poplar trees, and most of all she must forget that because of her Henri had let the Germans through. But Harvey did not meet her. There was a telegram saying he would meet her train if she wired when she was leaving. An exultant message breathing forgiveness and signed "With much love." She flushed when she read it. Of course he could not meet her in New York. This was not the continent in wartime, where convention had died of a great necessity. And he was not angry, after all. A great wave of relief swept over her. But it was odd how helpless she felt. Since her arrival in England months before there had always been Henri to look after things for her. It was incredible to recall how little she had done for herself. Was she glad to be back? She did not ask herself. It was as though the voyage had automatically detached her from that other Sara Lee of the little house. That was behind her, a dream, a mirage, or a memory. Here, a trifle confused by the bustle, was once again the Sara Lee who had knitted for Anna and tended the plants in the dining room window and watched Uncle James slowly lowered into his quiet grave. Part of her detachment was voluntary. She could not bear to remember. She had but to close her eyes to see Henri's tragic face that last night at Morley's. And part of the detachment was because, after all, the interlude had been but a matter of months, and reaching out familiar hands to her were the habits and customs and surroundings of all the earlier years of her life, drawing her back to them. It was strange how Henri's face haunted her. She could close her eyes and see it, line by line, his very swagger, for he did swagger, just a little, his tall figure and unruly hair, his long, narrow, muscular hands. Strange and rather uncomfortable, because she could not summon Harvey's image at all. She tried to bring before her, that night in the train speeding west, his solid figure and kind eyes as they would greet her the next day. Tried and failed. All she got was the profile of the photograph and the stubborn angle of the jaw. She was up very early the next morning, and it was then, as the train rolled through familiar country, that she began to find Harvey again. A flush of tenderness warmed her. She must be very kind to him because of all that he had suffered. The train came to a stop. Rather breathless, Sara Lee went out on the platform. Harvey was there, in the crowd. He did not see her at first. He was looking toward the front of the train, so her first glimpse of him was the view of the photograph. His hat was off, and his hair, carefully brushed back, gave him the eager look of the picture. He was a strong and manly figure, as unlike Henri as an oak is unlike one of Henri's own tall and swaying poplars. Sara Lee drew a long breath. Here after all were rest and peace, love and gentleness, quiet days and still evenings. No more crowds and wounds and weary men, no more great thunderings of guns, no imminence of death. Rest and peace. Then Harvey saw her, and the gleam of happiness and relief in his eyes made her own eyes misty. She saw even in that first glance that he looked thinner and older, and a pang of remorse shot through her. Was happiness always bought at the cost of happiness? Did one always take away in order to give? Not in so many words, but in a flash of doubt the thought went through her mind. There was no reserve in Harvey's embrace. He put his arms about her and held her close. He did not speak at first. Then, "My own little girl," he said. "My own little girl." Suddenly Sara Lee was very happy. All her doubts were swept away by his voice, his arms. There was no thrill for her in his caress, but there was peace and quiet joy. It was enough for her, just then, that she had brought back some of the happiness she had robbed him of. "Oh, Harvey," she said, "I am glad to be back again, with you." He held her off then and looked at her. "You are thin," he said. "You're not pale, but you are thin." And in a harder voice, "What did they do to you over there?" But he did not wait for a reply. He did not seem to want one. He picked up her bag and guiding her by the elbow piloted her through the crowd. "A lot of folks wanted to come and meet you," he said, "but I steered them off. You'd have thought Roosevelt was coming to town the way they've been calling up." "To meet me?" "I expect the Ladies' Aid Society wanted to get into the papers again," he said rather grimly. "They are merry little advertisers, all right." "I don't think that, Harvey." "Well, I do," he said, and brought her to a stop, facing a smart little car, very new, very gay. "How do you like it?" he asked. "Like it? Why, it's not yours, is it?" "Surest thing you know. Or rather, it's ours. Had a few war babies and they grew up." Sara Lee looked at it, and for just an instant, a rather sickening instant, she saw Henri's shattered low car, battle-scarred and broken. "It's lovely," said Sara Lee, and Harvey found no fault with her tone. Sara Lee had intended to go to Anna's, for a time at least, but she found that Belle was expecting her and would not take no. "She's moved the baby in with the others," Harvey explained as he took the wheel. "Wait until you see your room. I knew we'd be buying furniture soon, so I fixed it up." He said nothing for a time. He was new to driving a car, and the traffic engrossed him. But when they had reached a quieter neighborhood he put a hand over hers. "Good God, how I've been hungry for you," he said. "I guess I was pretty near crazy sometimes." He glanced at her apprehensively, but if she knew his connection with her recall she showed no resentment. As a matter of fact there was in his voice something that reminded her of Henri, the same deeper note, almost husky. She was, indeed, asking herself very earnestly what there was in her, of all people, that should make two men care for her as both Henri and Harvey cared. In the humility of all modest women she was bewildered. It made her rather silent and a little sad. She was so far from being what they thought her. Harvey, stealing a moment from the car to glance at her, saw something baffling in her face. "Do you still care, Sara Lee?" he asked almost diffidently. "As much as ever?" "I've come back to you," she said after an imperceptible pause. "Well, I guess that's the answer." He drew a deep, satisfied breath. "I used to think of you over there, and all those foreigners in uniform strutting about, and it almost got me, sometimes." And again, as long before, he read into her passivity his own passion, and was deeply content. Belle was waiting on the small front porch. There was an anxious frown on her face, and she looked first, not at Sara Lee, but at Harvey. What she saw there evidently satisfied her, for the frown disappeared. She kissed Sara Lee impulsively. All that afternoon, much to Harvey's resentment, Sara Lee received callers. The Ladies' Aid came en masse and went out to the dining room and there had tea and cake. Harvey disappeared when they came. "You are back," he said, "and safe, and all that. But it's not their fault, and I'll be hanged if I'll stand round and listen to them." He got his hat and then, finding her alone in a back hall for a moment, reverted uneasily to the subject. "There are two sides to every story," he said. "They're going to knife me this afternoon, all right. Damned hypocrites. You just keep your head, and I'll tell you my side of it later."
"Harvey," she said slowly, "I want to know now just what you did. I'm not angry. I've never been angry. But I ought to know."
It was a very one-sided story that Harvey told her, standing in the little back hall, with Belle's children hanging over the staircase and begging for cake. Yet in the main it was true. He had reached his limit of endurance. She was in danger, as the photograph plainly showed, and a fellow had a right to fight for his own happiness.
"I wanted you back, that's all,"
he ended, and added an anticlimax by passing a plate of sliced jelly roll through the stair rail to the clamoring children. Sara Lee stood there for a moment after he had gone. He was right, or at least he had been within his rights. She had never even heard of the new doctrine of liberty for women. There was nothing in her training to teach her revolt. She was engaged to Harvey. Already, potentially, she belonged to him. He had interfered with her life, but he had had the right to interfere. And also there was in the back of her mind a feeling that was almost guilt. She had let Henri tell her he loved her. She had even kissed him. And there had been many times in the little house when Harvey, for days at a time, had not even entered her thoughts. There was, therefore, a very real tenderness in the face she lifted for his good-bye kiss. To Belle in the front hall Harvey gave a firm order.
"Don't let any reporters in," he said warningly. "This is strictly our affair. It's a private matter. It's nobody's business what she did over there. She's home. That's all that matters."
Belle assented, but she was uneasy. She knew that Harvey was unreasonably, madly jealous of Sara Lee's work at the little house of mercy, and she knew him well enough to know that sooner or later he would show that jealousy. She felt, too, that the girl should have been allowed her small triumph without interference. There had been enough interference already. But it was easier to yield to Harvey than to argue with him. It was a rather worried Belle who served tea that afternoon in her dining room, with Mrs. Gregory pouring. The more uneasy, because she already divined a change in Sara Lee. She was as lovely as ever, even lovelier, but she had a poise, a steadiness, that were new, and silences in which, to Belle's shrewd eyes, she seemed to be weighing things. Reporters clamored to see Sara Lee that day, and failing to see her, telephoned Harvey at his office to ask if it was true that she had been decorated by the king. He was short to the point of affront.
"I haven't heard anything about it," he snapped, "and I wouldn't say if I had. But it's not likely. What do you fellows think she was doing, anyhow? Leading a charge? She was running a soup kitchen, that's all."
He hung up the receiver with a jerk, but shortly after that he fell to pacing his small office. She had not said anything about being decorated, but the reporters had said it had been in a London newspaper. If she had not told him that, there were probably many things she had not told him. But of course there had been very little time. He would see if she mentioned it that night. Sara Lee had had a hard day. The children loved her. In the intervals of calls they crawled over her, and the littlest one called her Sara Lee. She held the child in her arms, close. "Sara Lee," said the child, over and over.
Sara Lee, that's your name. I love your name."
And there came, echoing in her ears, Henri and his tender Sara Lee. There was an oppression on her, too. Her very bedroom thrust on her approaching marriage. This was her own furniture, for her new home. It was beautiful, simple and good. But she was not ready for marriage. She had been too close to the great struggle to be prepared to think in terms of peace so soon. Perhaps, had she dared to look deeper than that, she would have found something else, a something she had not counted on. She and Belle had a little time after the visitors had gone, before Harvey came home. They sat in Belle's bedroom, and her sentences were punctuated by little backs briskly presented to have small garments fastened, or bows put on stiffly bobbed yellow hair. "Did you understand my letter?" she asked. "I was sorry I had sent it, but it was too late then." "I put your letter and theirs together. I supposed that Harvey—" "He was about out of his mind," Belle said in her worried voice. "Stand still, Mary Ellen. He went to Mrs. Gregory, and I suppose he said a good bit. You know the way he does. Anyhow, she was very angry. She called a special meeting, and I tried to prevent their recalling you. He doesn't know that, of course." "You tried?" "Well, I felt as though it was your work," Belle said rather uncomfortably. "Bring me the comb, Alice. I guess we get pretty narrow here, and I've been following things more closely since you went over. I know more than I did, and, of course, after one marries there isn't much chance. There are children, and—" her face twisted. "I wish I could do something." She got up and brought from the dresser a newspaper clipping. "It's the London newspaper," she explained. "I've been taking it, but Harvey doesn't know. He doesn't care much for the English. This is about your being decorated." Sara Lee held it listlessly in her hands. "Shall I tell him, Belle?" she asked. Belle hesitated. "I don't believe I would," she said forlornly. "He won't like it. That's why I've never shown him that clipping. He hates it all so." Sara Lee dressed that evening in the white frock. She dressed slowly, thinking hard. All round her was the shiny newness of her furniture, a trifle crowded in Belle's small room. Sara Lee had a terrible feeling of being fastened in by it. Wherever she turned it gleamed. She felt surrounded, smothered. She had meant to make a clean breast of things, of the little house and of Henri, and of the King, pinning the medal on her shabby black jacket and shaking hands with her. Henri she must tell about. Not his name, of course, nor his madness, nor even his love. But she felt that she owed it to Harvey to have as few secrets from him as possible. She would tell about what the boy had done for her, and how he, and he alone, had made it all possible. Surely Harvey would understand. It was a page that was closed. It had held nothing to hurt him. She had come back. She stood by her window, thinking, and a breath of wind set the leaves outside to rustling. Instantly she was back again in the little house, and the sound was not leaves, but the shuffling of many stealthy feet on the cobbles of the street at night. That shuffling that was so like the rustling of leaves in a wood, or the murmur of water running over a stony creek bed. It was clear to Sara Lee from the beginning of the evening that Harvey did not intend to hear her story. He did not say so. Indeed, for a time he did not talk at all. He sat with his arms round her, content to just have her there. "I have a lot of arrears to make up," he said. "I've got to get used to having you where I can touch you. Tonight, when I go upstairs, I'm going to take that damned colorless photograph of you and throw it out the window." "I must tell you about your photograph," she ventured. "It always stood on the mantel over the stove, and when there was a threatened bombardment I used to put it under—" "Let's not talk, honey." When he came out of that particular silence he said abruptly, "Will Leete is dead." "Oh no. Poor Will Leete." "Died of pneumonia in some godforsaken hole over there. He left a wife and nothing much to keep her. That's what comes of mixing in the other fellow's fight. I guess we can get the house as soon as we want it. She has to sell, and it ought to be a bargain."
"Harvey," she said rather timidly, "you speak of the other fellow's fight. They say over there that we are sure to be drawn into it sooner or later."
"Not on our life," he replied brusquely. "And if you don't mind, honey, I don't care to hear about what they think over there."
He got up from his old place on the arm of her chair and stood on the rug.
"I'd better tell you now how I feel about this thing. I can't talk about it, that's all. We'll finish up now and let it go at that. I'm sorry there's a war. I'll send money when I can afford it, to help the Belgians, although my personal opinion is that they're getting theirs for what they did in the Congo. But I don't want to hear about what you did over there."
He saw her face, and he went to her and kissed her cheek.
"I don't want to hurt you, honey," he said. "I love you with all my heart. But somehow I can't forget that you left me and went over there when there was no reason for it. You put off our marriage, and I suppose we'd better get over it. Go ahead and tell me about it."
He drew up a chair and waited, but the girl smiled rather tremulously. "Perhaps we'd better wait, if you feel that way, Harvey."
His face was set as he looked at her. "There's only one thing I want to know," he said, "and I've got a right to know that. You're a young girl, and you're beautiful, to me anyhow. You've been over there with a lot of crazy foreigners."
He got up again, and all the bitterness of the empty months was in his voice.
"Did any of them? Was there anybody there that you cared about?"
"I came back, Harvey."
"That's not the question."
"There were many men, officers, who were kind to me.
"That's not the question either."
"If I had loved anyone more than I love you, I should not have come back."
"Wait a minute," he said quickly. "You had to come back, you know."
"I could have stayed. The English woman who took over my work asked me to stay on and help her."
He was satisfied then. He went back to the arm of her chair and kissed her. "All right," he said. "I've suffered the tortures of the damned, but that fixes it. Now let's talk about something else. I'm sick of this war talk."
"I'd like to tell you about my little house, and poor Rene."
"Who's Rene?"
he demanded. "The orderly."
"The one on the step, with the rifle?"
"Yes."
"Look here," he said. "I've got to get all that gradually. I don't know that I'll ever get to it cheerfully. But I can't talk about that place tonight. And I don't want to talk war. The whole business makes me sick. I've got a car out of it, and if things keep on we may be able to get the Leete house. But there's no reason in it, no sense. I'm sick to death of hearing about it. Let's talk of something else."
But, and here was something strange, Sara Lee could find nothing else to talk about. The thing that she had looked forward so eagerly to telling, that was barred, and the small gossip of their little circle, purely personal and trivial, held only faint interest for her. For the first time they had no common ground to meet on. Yet it was a very happy man who went whistling to his room that night. He was rather proud of himself, too. After all the bitterness of the past months, he had been gentle and loving to Sara Lee. He had not scolded her. In the next room he could hear her going quietly about, opening and closing the drawers of the new bureau, moving a chair. Pretty soon, God willing, they need never be separated. He would have her always, to protect and cherish and love. He went outside to her closed door.
"Good night, sweetheart,"
he called softly. "Good night, dear," came her soft reply. But long after he was asleep Sara Lee stood at her window and listened to the leaves, so like the feet of weary men on the ruined street over there. For the first time she was questioning the very thing she had done. She loved Harvey, but there were many kinds of love. There was the love of Jean for Henri. And there was the wonderful love, though the memory now was cruel and hurt her, of Henri for herself. And there was the love of Marie for the memory of Maurice, the spy. Many kinds of love, and one heart might love many people, in different ways. A small doubt crept into her mind. This feeling she had for Harvey was not what she had thought it was over there. It was a thing that had belonged to a certain phase of her life. But that phase was over. It was, like Marie's, but a memory. This Harvey of the new car and the increased income and the occasional hardness in his voice was not the Harvey she had left. Or perhaps it was she who had changed. She wondered. She felt precisely the same, tender toward her friends, unwilling to hurt them. She did not want to hurt Harvey. But she did not love him as he deserved to be loved. And she had a momentary lift of the veil when she saw the long vista of the years, the two of them always together and always between them hidden, untouched, but eating like a cancer, Harvey's resentment and suspicion of her months away from him. There would always be a barrier between them, not only on Harvey's side. There were things she had no right to tell, of Henri, of his love and care for her, and of that last terrible day when he realized what he had done. That night, lying in the new bed, she faced that situation too. How much was she to blame? If Henri felt that each life lost was lost by him, Wasn't the same true for her? Why had she allowed him to stay in London? But that was one question she did not answer frankly. She lay there in the darkness and wondered what punishment he would receive. He had done so much for them over there. Surely, surely they would allow for that. But small things came back to her. The awful sight of the miller and his son, led away to death, with the sacks over their heads. The relentlessness of it all. The expecting that men should give everything, even life itself, and ask for no mercy. And this, too, she remembered. Once in a wild moment Henri had said that he would follow her to America, and that there he would prove to her that his and not Harvey's was the real love of her life. The great love that comes but once to any woman, and to some not at all. Yet on that last night at Morley's he had said what she now felt was a final farewell. That last look of his, from the doorway, that had been the look of a man who would fill his eyes for the last time. She got up and stood by the window. What had they done to him? What would they do? She looked at her watch. It was 4 o'clock in the morning over there. The little house would be quiet now, but down along the lines men would be standing on the firing strip of the trench and waiting, against what the dawn might bring. Through the thin wall came the sound of Harvey's heavy, regular breathing. She remembered Henri's light sleeping on the kitchen floor, his cap on the table, his cape rolled round him, sleeping, for all his weariness, so light that he always seemed half conscious. She remembered the innumerable times he had come in at this hour, muddy, sometimes rather gray of face with fatigue, but always cheerful. It was just such an hour that she found him giving hot coffee to the German prisoner. It had been but a little earlier when he had taken her to the roof and had there shown her Rene, lying with his face up toward the sky which had sent him death. 100 memories crowded, Henri's love for the Belgian soldiers and theirs for him, his humor, his absurd riddles. There was the one he had asked Rene, the very day before the air attack. He had stood stiffly and frowningly before the boy, and he had asked him in a highly official tone, "What must a man be to be buried with military honors?" "A general?" "No." "An officer?" "No, no. Use your head, boy. This is very important. A mistake would be most serious." Rene had shaken his head dejectedly. "He must be dead, Rene," Henri had said gravely. "Entirely dead. As I said, it is well to know these things. A mistake would be unfortunate." His blue eyes had gleamed with fun, but his face had remained frowning. It was quite 5 minutes before she had heard Rene chuckling on the doorstep. Was he still living, this Henri of the love of life and courting of death? Could anything so living die? And if he had died, had it been because of her? She faced that squarely for the first time. "Perhaps even beyond the stars they have need of a little house of mercy. And, God knows, wherever I am, I shall have need of you." Beyond the partition Harvey slept on, his arms under his head. Harvey was clamoring for an early wedding. And indeed there were very few arguments against it, save one that Sara Lee buried in her heart. Belle's house was small, and though she was welcome there, and more than that, Sara Lee knew that she was crowding the family. Perhaps Sara Lee would have agreed in the end. There seemed to be nothing else to do, though by the end of the first week she was no longer in any doubt as to what her feeling for Harvey really was. It was kindness, affection, but it was not love. She would marry him because she had promised to, and because their small world expected her to do so, and because she could not shame him again. For, to her surprise, she found that that was what he had felt, a strange, self-conscious shame, like that of a man who has been jilted. She felt that by coming back to him she had forfeited the right to break the engagement. So every hour of every day seemed to make the thing more inevitable. Belle was embroidering towels for her in her scant leisure. Even Anna, with the second child coming, sent in her contribution to the bride's linen chest. But almost desperately insisting on a visit to Aunt Harriet, she got a reprieve of a month. And Harvey was inclined to be jealous even of that. Sometimes, but mostly at night when she was alone, a hot wave of resentment overwhelmed her. Why should she be forced into the thing? Was there any prospect of happiness after marriage when there was so little before? For she realized now that even Harvey was not happy. He had at last definitely refused to hear the story of the little house.
"I'd just rather forget it, honey," he said.
But inconsistently he knew she did not forget it, and it angered him. True to his insistence on ignoring those months of her absence, she made no attempt to tell him. Now and then, however, closed in the library together, they would fail of things to talk about, and Sara Lee's knitting needles would be the only sound in the room. At those times he would sit back in his chair and watch the faraway look in her eyes, and it maddened him. From her busy life Belle studied them both, with an understanding she did not reveal. And one morning when the mail came she saw Sara Lee's face as she turned away, finding there was no letter for her, and made an excuse to follow her to her room. The girl was standing by the window looking out. The children were playing below, and the maple trees were silent. Belle joined her there and slipped an arm round her. "Why are you doing it, Sara Lee?" she asked. "Doing what?" "Marrying Harvey." Sara Lee looked at her with startled eyes. "I'm engaged to him, Belle. I've promised." "Exactly," said Belle dryly. "But that's hardly a good reason, is it? It takes more than a promise." She stared down at the flock of children in the yard below. "Harvey's a man," she said. "He doesn't understand. But I do. You've got to care a whole lot, Sara Lee, if you're going to go through with it. It takes a lot of love, when it comes to having children and all that." "He's so good, Belle. How can I hurt him?" "You'll hurt him a whole lot more by marrying him when you don't love him." "If only I could have a little time!" she cried wildly. I'm tired, Belle. And I can't forget about the war and all that. I've tried. Sometimes I think if we could talk it over together I'd get it out of my mind." "He won't talk about it?" "No." "He's my own brother, and I love him dearly. But sometimes I think he's hard. Not that he's ever ugly," she hastened to add. "But he's stubborn. There's a sort of wall in him, and he puts some things behind it. And it's like beating against a rock to try and get at them." After a little silence she said hesitatingly, "We've got him to think of, too. He has a right to be happy. Sometimes I've looked at you. You're so pretty, Sara Lee. And I've wondered if there wasn't some one over there who cared for you." "There was one man, an officer. Oh, Belle, I can't tell you. Not you." "Why not?" asked Belle practically. "You ought to talk it out with some one, and if Harvey insists on being a fool that's his own fault." For all the remainder of that sunny morning Sara Lee talked what was in her heart, and Belle, poor, romantic, starved Belle, heard and thrilled. She made buttonholes as she listened, but once or twice a new tone in Sara Lee's voice caused her to look up. Here was a new Sara Lee, a creature of vibrant voice and glowing eyes, and Belle was not stupid. She saw that it was Henri whose name brought the deeper note. Sara Lee had stopped with her recall, had stopped and looked about the room with its shiny new furniture, and had shivered. Belle bent over her work. "Why don't you go back?" she asked. Sara Lee looked at her piteously. "How can I? There's Harvey. And the society would not send me again. It's over, Belle. All over." After a pause Belle said, "What's become of Henri? He hasn't written, has he?" Sara Lee got up and went to the window. "I don't know where he is. He may be dead." Her voice was flat and lifeless. Belle knew all that she wanted to know. She rose and gathered up her sewing. "I'm going to talk to Harvey. You're not going to be rushed into a wedding. You're tired, and it's all nonsense. Well, I'll have to run now and dress the children." That night Harvey and Belle had almost a violent scene. He had taken Sara Lee over to the Leete house that evening. Will Leete's widow had met them there, a small sad figure in her mourning, but very composed, until she opened the door into a tiny room upstairs with a desk and a lamp in it. "This was Will's study," she said. "He did his work here in the evenings, and I sat in that little chair and sewed. I never thought then—" her lips quivered.
"Pretty rotten of Will Leete to leave that little thing alone," said Harvey on their way home. "He had his fling, and she's paying for it."
But Sara Lee was silent. It was useless to try to make Harvey understand the urge that had called Will Leete across the sea to do his share for the war, and that had brought him that peace of God that passeth all understanding. It was not a good time for Belle to put up to him her suggestion for a delay in the marriage, that evening after their return. He took it badly and insisted on sending upstairs for Sara Lee. "Did you ask Belle to do this?" he demanded bluntly. "To do what?" "To put the thing off." "I have already told you, Harvey," Belle put in. "It is my own idea. She is tired. She's been through a lot. I've heard the story you're too stubborn to listen to, and I strongly advise her to wait a while." And, after a time, he agreed ungraciously. He would buy the house and fix it over, and in the early fall it would be ready. "Unless," he added to Sara Lee with a bitterness born of disappointment, "unless you change your mind again." He did not kiss her that night when she and Belle went together up the stairs, but he stared after her gloomily, with hurt and bewilderment in his eyes. He did not understand. He never would. She had come home to him all gentleness and tenderness, ready to find in him the thing she needed so badly. But out of his obstinacy and hurt he had himself built up a barrier. That night Sara Lee dreamed that she was back in the little house of mercy. René was there, and Henri, and Jean with the patch over his eye. They were waiting for the men to come, and the narrow hall was full of the odor of Marie's soup. Then she heard them coming, the shuffling of many feet on the road. She went to the door, with Henri beside her, and watched them coming up the road, a deeper shadow in the blackness. Tired men, wounded men, homeless men, coming to her little house with its firelight and its warmth. Here and there the match that lighted a cigarette showed a white but smiling face. They stopped before the door, and the warm little house, with its guarded lights and its food and cheer, took them in. A very pale and desperate Henri took the night train for Folkestone after he had said good-bye to Sara Lee. He alternately chilled and burned with fever, and when he slept, as he did now and then, going off suddenly into a doze and waking with a jerk, it was to dream of horrors. He thought, in his wilder intervals, of killing himself, but his code did not include such a shirker's refuge. He was going back to tell his story and to take his punishment. He had cabled to Jean to meet him at Calais, but when, at dawn the next morning, the Channel boat drew in to the wharf there was no sign of Jean or the car. Henri regarded the empty quay with apathetic eyes. They would come, later on. If only he could get his head down and sleep for a while he would be better able to get toward the front. For he knew now that he was ill. He had, indeed, been ill for days, but he did not realize that. And he hated illness. He regarded it with suspicion, as a weakness not for a strong man. The drowsy girl in her chair at the Gare Maritime regarded him curiously and with interest. Many women turned to look after Henri, but he did not know this. Had he known it he would have regarded it much as he did illness. The stupid boy was not round. The girl herself took the key and led the way down the long corridor upstairs to a room. Henri stumbled in and fell across the bed. He was almost immediately asleep. Late in the afternoon he wakened. Strange that Jean had not come. He got up and bathed his face. His right arm was very stiff now, and pains ran from the old wound in his chest down to the fingers of his hand. He tried to exercise to limber it, and grew almost weak with pain. At 6:00, when Jean had not come, Henri resorted to ways that he knew of and secured a car. He had had some coffee by that time, and he felt much better. So well, indeed, that he sang under his breath a strange rambling sound that sounded rather like René's rendering of Tipperary. The driver looked at him curiously every now and then. It was 10:00 when they reached La Panne. Henri went at once to the villa set high on a sand dune where the King's secretary lived. The house was dark, but in the library at the rear there was a light. He stumbled along the paths beside the house and reached at last, after interminable miles, when the path sometimes came up almost to his eyes and again fell away so that it seemed to drop from under his feet. At last he reached the long French doors, with their drawn curtains. He opened the door suddenly and thereby surprised the secretary, who was a most dignified and rather nervous gentleman, into laying his hand on a heavy inkwell. "I wish to see the King," said Henri in a loud tone. Because at that moment the secretary, lamp and inkwell and all, retired suddenly to a very great distance. as if one had viewed them through the reverse end of an opera glass. The secretary knew Henri. He, too, eyed him curiously. "The king has retired, monsieur." "I think," said Henri in a dangerous tone, "that he will see me." To tell the truth, the secretary rather thought so too. There was a strange rumor going round, to the effect that the boy had followed a woman to England at a critical time, which would have been a pity, the secretary thought. There were so many women, and so few men like Henri. The secretary considered it gravely. Henri was by that time in a chair, but it moved about so that he had to hold very tight to the arms. When he looked up again the secretary had picked up his soft black hat and was at the door. "I shall inquire," he said. Henri saluted him stiffly, with his left hand, as he went out. The secretary went to His Majesty's equerry, who was in the next house playing solitaire and trying to forget the family he had left on the other side of the line. So it was that in due time Henri again traversed miles of path and pavement, between tall borders of wild sea grass, miles which perhaps were 100 yards, and went round the screen and found the king on the hearthrug. But when he drew himself stiffly to attention he overdid the thing rather, and went over backwards with a crash. He was up again almost immediately, very flushed and uncomfortable. After that he kept himself in hand, but the king, who had a way all his own of forgetting his divine right to rule, and a great many other things, the king watched him gravely. Henri sat in a chair and made a clean breast of it. Because he was feeling rather strange he told a great many things that an agent of the Secret Service is hardly expected to reveal to his king. He mentioned, for instance, the color of Sara Lee's eyes, and the way she bandaged, like one who had been trained. Once, in the very middle of his narrative, where he had put the letter from the front in his pocket and decided to go to England anyhow, he stopped and hummed René's version of Tipperary. Only a bar or two. Then he remembered. But one thing brought him round with a start. "Then," the king said slowly, "Jean was not with you?" "Only he did not call him Jean. He gave him his other name, which, like Henri's, is not to be told." Henri's brain cleared then with the news that Jean was missing. When, somewhat later, he staggered out of the villa, it was under royal instruction to report to the great hospital along the sea front and near by, and there to go to bed and have a doctor. Indeed, because the boy's eyes were wild by that time, the equerry went along and held his arm. But that was because Henri was in open revolt, and while walking steadily enough showed a tendency to bolt every now and then. He would stop on the way and argue, though one does not argue easily with an equerry. "I must go," he would say fretfully. "God knows where he is. He'd never give me up if I were the one." And once he shook off the equerry violently and said, "Let go of me, I tell you. I'll come back and go to bed when I've found him." The equerry soothed him like a child. An English nurse took charge of Henri in the hospital and put him to bed. He was very polite to her and extremely cynical. She sat in a chair by his bed and held the key of the room in her hand. Once he thought that she was Sara Lee, but that was only for a moment. She did not look like Sara Lee. And she was suspicious, too, for when he asked her what she could put in her left hand that she could not put in her right, she moved away and placed the door key on the stand, out of reach. However, toward morning she dozed. There was steady firing at Nieuport and the windows shook constantly. An ambulance came in, followed by a stirring on the lower floor. Then silence. He got up then and secured the key. There was no time for dressing, because she was a suspicious person and likely to waken at any time. He rolled his clothing into a bundle and carried it under his well arm. The other was almost useless. The ambulance was still waiting outside, at the foot of the staircase. There were voices and lights in the operating room, forward along the tiled hall. Still in his night clothing, Henri got into the ambulance and threw his uniform behind him. Then he got the car under way. Outside the village he paused long enough to dress. His head was amazingly clear. He had never felt so sure of himself before. As to his errand he had no doubt whatever. Jean had learned that he had crossed the Channel. Therefore Jean had taken up his work. Jean, who had but one eye and was as clumsy as a bear. The thought of Jean crawling through the German trenches set him laughing until he ended with a sob. It was rather odd about the ambulance. It did not keep the road very well. Sometimes it was on one side and sometimes on the other. It slid as though the road were greased. After a time Henri made an amazing discovery. He was not alone in the car. He looked back, without stopping, and the machine went off in a wide arc. He brought it back again, grinning. "Thought you had me, didn't you?" he observed to the car in general, and the engine in particular. "Now, no tricks!" There was a wounded man in the car. He had had morphia, and he was very comfortable. He was not badly hurt, and he considered that he was being taken to Calais. He was too tired to talk, and the swinging of the car rather interested him. He would doze and waken and doze again. But at last he heard something that made him rise on his elbow. It was the hammering of the big guns. He called Henri's attention to this, but Henri said, "Lie down, Jean, and don't talk. We'll make it yet." The wounded man intended to protest, but he went to sleep instead. They had reached the village now, where was the little house of mercy. The ambulance rolled and leaped down the street, with both lights full on, which was forbidden, and came to a stop at the door. The man inside was grunting then, and Henri, whose head had never been so clear, got out and went round to the rear of the car. "Now, out with you, comrade," he said. "I have made an error, but it is immaterial. Can you walk?" He lighted a cigarette, and the man inside saw his burning eyes and shaking hands. Even through the apathy of the morphia he felt a thrill of terror. He could walk. He got out while Henri pounded at the door. "Attention!" he called. "Attention!" Then he hummed an air of the camps. "Trou la la, ça ne va guère. Trou la la, ça ne va pas." When he heard steps inside, Henri went back to the ambulance. He got in and drove it, lights and all, down the street. "Trou la la, ça ne va guère. Trou la la, ça ne va pas." Somewhere down the road, beyond the poplar trees, he abandoned the ambulance. They found it there the next morning, or rather what was left of it. Evidently its two unwinking eyes had got on the Germans' nerves. Early the next morning a Saxon regiment, standing on the firing step ready for what the dawn might bring forth, watched the mist rise from the water in front of them. It shone on the body of a Belgian in uniform lying across their wire, and very close indeed. Now, the Saxons are not Prussians, so no one for good sport fired at the body, which was rather a good thing, because it moved slightly and stirred. And then in a loud voice, which is an unusual thing for bodies to possess, it began to sing, "Trou la la, ça ne va guère. Trou la la, ça ne va pas." Late in August Sara Lee broke her engagement with Harvey. She had been away, at Cousin Jennie's, for a month, and for the first time since her return she had had time to think. In the little suburban town there were long hours of quiet when Cousin Jennie mended on the porch and Aunt Harriet, enjoying a sort of reflected glory from Sara Lee, presided at Red Cross meetings. Sara Lee decided to send for Harvey, and he came for a weekend, arriving pathetically eager, but with a sort of defiance too. He was determined to hold her, but to hold her on his own terms. Aunt Harriet had been vaguely uneasy, but Harvey's arrival seemed to put everything right. She even kissed him when he came, and took great pains to carry off Cousin Jennie when she showed an inclination toward conversation and a seat on the porch. Sara Lee had made a desperate resolve. She intended to lay all her cards on the table. He should know all that there was to know. If after that he still wanted to hold her, but she did not go so far. She was so sure he would release her. It was a despairing thing to do, but she was rather despairing those days. There had been no letter from Henri or from Jean. She had written them both several times, at Dunkirk, to the Savoy in London, to the little house near the front, but no replies had come. Yet mail was going through. Mabel Andrews' letters from Boulogne came regularly. When August went by with no letters save Harvey's, begging her to come back, she gave up at last. In the little church on Sundays, with Jennie on the one side and Aunt Harriet on the other, she voiced small silent prayers, that the thing she feared had not happened. But she could not think of Henri as not living. He was too strong, too vital. She did not understand herself those days. She was desperately unhappy. Sometimes she wondered if it would not be easier to know the truth, even if that truth comprehended the worst. Once she received, from some unknown hand, a French journal, and pored over it for days with her French dictionary, to find out if it contained any news. It was not until a week later that she received a letter from Mabel, explaining that she had sent the journal, which contained a description of her hospital. All of Harvey's Sunday she spent in trying to bring her courage to the point of breaking the silence he had imposed on her, but it was not until evening that she succeeded. The house was empty. The family had gone to church. On the veranda, with the heavy scent of phlox at night permeating the still air, Sara Lee made her confession. She began at the beginning. Harvey did not stir until she told of the way she had stowed away to cross the channel. Then he moved.
"This fellow who planned that out for you, did you ever see him again?"
"He met me in Calais."
"And then what?"
"He took me to Dunkirk in his car. Such a hideous car, Harvey. All wrecked. It had been under fire again and again.
"He took you to Dunkirk? Who was with you?"
"Just Jean, the chauffeur."
"I like his nerve. Wasn't there in all that God-forsaken country a woman to take with you? You and this what was his name, anyhow?"
"I can't tell you that, Harvey."
"Look here!" he burst out. "How much of this aren't you going to tell? Because I want it all or not at all."
"I can't tell you his name. I'm only trying to make you understand the way I feel about things. His name doesn't matter." She clenched her hands in the darkness. "I don't think he's alive now." He tried to see her face, but she turned it away.
"Dead, eh? What makes you think that?"
"I haven't heard from him."
"Why should you hear from him?" His voice cut out like a knife. "Look at me. Why should he write to you?"
"He cared for me, Harvey." He sat in a heavy silence which alarmed her. "Don't be angry, please," she begged. "I couldn't bear it. It wasn't my fault, or his either."
"The damned scoundrel!"
said Harvey thickly. But she reached over and put a trembling hand over his lips. "Don't say that," she said. "Don't. I won't allow you to. When I think of what might have happened to him,
Her voice broke. "Go on," Harvey said in cold tones she had never heard before. "Tell it all now. Now you've begun it. God knows I didn't want to hear it. He took you to the hotel at Dunkirk, the way those foreigners take their women, and he established you in the house at the front, I suppose, like a—"
Sara Lee suddenly stood up and drew off her ring. "You needn't go on," she said quietly. "I had a decision to make tonight, and I have made it. Ever since I came home I have been trying to go back to where I was before I left. It is impossible. You are what you always were, Harvey, but I've changed. I can't go back." She put the ring into his hand. "It isn't that you don't love me. I think you do. But I've been thinking things over. It isn't only tonight, or what you just said. It's because we don't care for the same things, or believe in them."
"But if we love each other—"
"It's not that either. I used to feel that way. A home, and someone to care about, and a little pleasure, and work."
"That ought to be enough, honey."
He was terrified. His anger was gone. He placed an appealing hand on her arm, and as she stood there in the faint starlight the wonder of her once again got him by the throat. She had that sort of repressed eagerness, that look of being poised for flight, that had always made him feel cheap and unworthy.
"Isn't that enough, honey?"
he repeated. "Not now," she said, her eyes turned toward the east. "These are great days, Harvey. They are greater and more terrible than any one can know who has not been there. I've been there, and I know. I haven't the right to all this peace and comfort when I know how things are going over there." Down the quiet street of the little town service was over. The last hymn had been sung. Through the open windows came the mellow sound of the minister's voice in benediction, too far away to be more than a tone, like a single deep note of the organ. Sara Lee listened. She knew the words he was saying, and she listened with her eyes turned to the east. "The peace of God that passeth all understanding be and abide with you all, forevermore. Amen." Sara Lee listened, and from the step below her Harvey watched her with furtive, haggard eyes. He had not heard the benediction. "The peace of God," she said slowly. "There is only one peace of God, Harvey, and that is service. I'm going back."
"Service!" he scoffed. "You are going back to him."
"I'm afraid he is not there any more. I'm going back to work. But if he is there—"
Harvey slid the ring into his pocket. "What if he's not there?" he demanded bitterly. "If you think, after all this, that I'm going to wait, on the chance of your coming back to me, you're mistaken. I've been a laughingstock long enough."
In the light of her new decision Sara Lee viewed him for the first time with the pitiless eyes of women who have lost a faith. She saw him for what he was, not deliberately cruel, not even unkindly, but selfish, small, without vision. Harvey was for his own fireside, his office, his little family group. His labor would always be for himself and his own. Whereas Sara Lee was, now and forever, for all the world, her hands consecrated to bind up its little wounds and to soothe its great ones. Harvey craved a cheap and easy peace. She wanted no peace except that brought by service, the peace of a tired body, the peace of the little house in Belgium where, after days of torture, weary men found quiet and ease and the cheer of the open door. Late in October Sara Lee went back to the little house of mercy, went unaccredited and with her own money. She had sold a bit of her property. In London she went to the Traverses, as before. But with a difference, too. For Sara Lee had learned the strangeness of the English, who are slow to friendships, but who never forget. Indeed, a telegram met her at Liverpool, asking her to stop with them in London. She replied, refusing but thanking them, and saying she would call the next afternoon. Everything was the same at Morley's. Rather a larger percentage of men in uniform, perhaps, greater crowds in the square, a little less of the optimism which in the spring had predicted victory before autumn, but the same high courage, for all that. August greeted her like an old friend. Even the waiters bowed to her, and upstairs the elderly chambermaid fussed over her like a mother. "And you're going back!" she exclaimed. "Fancy that now! You are brave, miss." But her keen eyes saw a change in Sara Lee. Her smile was the same, but there were times when she forgot to finish a sentence, and stood, that first morning, for an hour by the window, looking out as if she saw nothing. She went, before the visit to the Traverses, to the church of St. Martin in the Fields. It was empty, save for a woman in the corner, who did not kneel, but sat staring quietly before her. Sara Lee prayed an inarticulate bit of a prayer, that what the Traverses would have to tell her should not be the thing that she feared, but that, if it were, she would be given courage to meet it and to go on with her work. The Traverses would know. Mrs. Cameron was a friend. They would know about Henri and about Jean. Soon, within the hour, she would learn everything. So she asked for strength, and then sat there for a time, letting the peace of the old church quiet her, as had the broken walls and shattered altar of that other church across the Channel. It was rather a surprise to Sara Lee to have Mrs. Travers put her arms about her and kiss her. Mr. Travers, too, patted her hand when he took it. But they had, for all that, the reserve of their class. Much that they felt about Sara Lee they did not express even to each other. "We are so grateful to you," Mrs. Travers said. "I am only one mother, and of course now—" she looked down at her black dress. "But how many mothers there are who will want to thank you, when this terrible thing is over, and they learn about you." Mr. Travers had been eyeing Sara Lee. "Didn't use you up, did it?" he asked. "You're not looking quite fit." Sara Lee was very pale just then. In a moment she would know. "I am quite well," she said. Do you hear from Mrs. Cameron?" "Frequently. She has worked hard, but she is not young." It was Mrs. Travers who spoke. "She's afraid of the winter there. I rather think, since you want to go back, that she will be glad to turn your domain over to you for a time." "Then the little house is still there?" "Indeed, yes. A very famous little house indeed. But it is always known as your house. She has felt like a temporary chatelaine. She always thought you would come back." Tea had come, as before. The momentary stir gave her a chance to brace herself. Mr. Travers brought her cup to her and smiled gently down at her. "We have a plan to talk over," he said, "when you have had your tea. I hope you will agree to it." He went back to the hearthrug. "When I was there before," Sara Lee said, trying to hold her cup steady, "there was a young Belgian officer who was very kind to me. Indeed, all the credit for what I did belongs to him. And since I went home, I haven't heard—" Her voice broke suddenly. Mr. Travers glanced at his wife. Not for nothing had Mrs. Cameron written her long letters to these old friends, in the quiet summer afternoons when the sun shone down on the lifeless street before the little house. "I'm afraid we have bad news for you." Mrs. Travers put down her untasted tea. Or rather, we have no news. Of course," she added, seeing Sara Lee's eyes, "in this war no news may be the best. That is, he may be a prisoner." "That," Sara Lee heard herself say, "is impossible. If they captured him they would shoot him." Mrs. Travers nodded silently. They knew Henri's business, too, by that time, and that there was no hope for a captured spy. "And Jean?" They did not know of Jean, so she told them, still in that faraway voice. And at last Mrs. Travers brought an early letter of Mrs. Cameron's and read a part of it aloud. "He seems to have been delirious," she said, holding her reading glasses to her eyes. "A friend of his, very devoted to him, was missing, and he learned this somehow. He escaped from the hospital and got away in an ambulance. He came straight here and wakened us. There had been a wounded man in the machine, and he left him on our doorstep. When I got to the door the car was going wildly toward the front, with both lamps lighted. We did not understand then, of course, and no one thought of following it. The ambulance was found smashed by a shell the next morning, and at first we thought that he had been in it. But there was no sign that he had been. And that night one of the men from the trenches insisted that he had climbed out of a firing trench where the soldiers stood, and had gone forward, bareheaded, toward the German lines. I'm afraid it was the end. The men, however, who all loved him, do not think so. It seems that he has done miracles again and again. I understand that along the whole Belgian line they watch for him at night. The other night a German on reconnaissance got very close to our wire, and was greeted not by shouts, but by a wild hurrah. He was almost paralyzed with surprise. They brought him here on the way back to the prison camp, and he still looked dazed." Sara Lee sat with her hands clenched. Mrs. Travers folded the letter and put it back into its envelope. "How long ago was that?" Sara Lee asked in a low tone. "Because, if he was coming back at all—" "4 months." Suddenly Sara Lee stood up. "I think I ought to tell you," she said with a dead white face, "that I am responsible. He cared for me, and I was in love with him, too. Only I didn't know it then. I let him bring me to England I suppose it was because I loved him. I didn't think then that it was that. I was engaged to a man at home." "Sit down," said Mr. Travers. "My dear child, nothing can be your fault." "He came with me, and the Germans got through. He had had word, but—" "Have you your salts?" Mr. Travers asked quietly to his wife. "I'm not fainting. I'm only utterly wretched." The Traverses looked at each other. They were English. They had taken their own great loss quietly, because it was an individual grief and must not be intruded on the sorrow of a nation. But they found this white-faced girl infinitely appealing, a small and fragile figure, to whose grief must be added, without any fault of hers, a bitter and lasting remorse. Sara Lee stood up and tried to smile. "Please don't worry about me," she said. "I need something to do, that's all. You see, I've been worrying for so long. If I can get to work and try to make up I'll not be so hopeless. But I am not quite hopeless, either," she added hastily. It was as though by the very words she had consigned Henri to death. "You see, I am like the men. I won't give him up. And perhaps some night he will come across from the other side, out of the dark." Mr. Travers took her back to the hotel. When he returned from paying off the taxi he found her looking across the square. "Do you remember," she asked him, "the time when the little donkey was hurt over there?" "I shall never forget it." "And the young officer who ran out when I did, and shot the poor thing?" Mr. Travers remembered. "That was he, the man we have been speaking of." For the first time that day her eyes filled with tears. Sara Lee, at 20, was already living in her memories. So again the lights went down in front, and the backdrop became a veil and invisible. And to Sara Lee there came back again some of the characters of the early mise en scène: marching men, forage wagons, squadrons of French cavalry escorting various staffs, commandeered farm horses with shaggy fetlocks fastened in rope corrals, artillery rumbling along rutted roads which shook the gunners almost off their limbers. Nothing was changed, and everything. There was no Rene to smile his adoring smile, but Marie came out, sobbing and laughing, and threw herself into the girl's arms. The little house was the same, save for a hole in the kitchen wall. There were the great piles of white bowls and the shining kettles. There was the corner of her room, patched by René's hands, now so long quiet. A few more shell holes in the street, many more little crosses in the field near the poplar trees, more Allied aeroplanes in the air. That was all that was changed. But to Sara Lee everything was changed, for all that. The little house was grave and still, like a house of the dead. Once it had echoed to young laughter, had resounded to the noise and excitement of Henri's every entrance. Even when he was not there, it was as though it but waited for him to stir it into life, and small echoes of his gaiety had seemed to cling to its old walls. Sara Lee stood on the doorstep and looked within. She had come back. Here she would work and wait, and if in the goodness of Providence he should come back, here he would find her, all the empty months gone and forgotten. If he did not, "I shall still be calling you and waiting," he had written. She, too, would call and wait, and if not here, then surely in the fullness of time which is eternity, the call would be answered. In October Sara Lee took charge again of the little house. Mrs. Cameron went back to England, but not until the Traverses' plan had been revealed. They would support the little house, as a memorial to the son who had died. It was, Mrs. Travers wrote, the finest tribute they could offer to his memory, that night after night tired and ill and wounded men might find sanctuary, even for a little time, under her care. Luxuries began to come across the Channel, food and dressings and tobacco, knitted things, too, for another winter was coming, and already the frost lay white on the fields in the mornings. The little house took on a new air of prosperity. There were days when it seemed almost swaggering with opulence. It had need of everything, however. With the prospect of a second winter, when an advance was impossible, the Germans took to hammering again. Bombardment was incessant. The little village was again under suspicion, and there came days of terror when it seemed as though even the fallen masonry must be reduced to powder. The church went entirely. By December Sara Lee had ceased to take refuge during the bombardments. The fatalism of the front had got her. She would die or live according to the great plan, and nothing could change that. She did not greatly care which, except for her work, and even that she felt could be carried on by another as well. There was no news of Henri, but once the King's equerry, going by, had stopped to see her and had told her the story. "He was ill, undoubtedly," he said. "Even when he went to London he was ill and not responsible. The King understands that. He was a brave boy, mademoiselle." But the last element of hope seemed to go with that verification of his illness. He was delirious, and he had gone in that condition into the filthy, chill waters of the inundation. Well and sane there had been a chance, but plunging wild-eyed and reckless into that hell across, there was none. She did her best in the evenings to be cheerful, to take the place, in her small and serious fashion, of Henri's old gaiety. But the soldiers whispered among themselves that mademoiselle was in grief, as they were, for the blithe young soldier who was gone. What hope Sara Lee had died almost entirely early in December. On the evening of a day when a steady rain had turned the roads into slimy pitfalls, and the ditches into canals, there came, brought in by a Belgian corporal, the man that swore that Henri had passed him in his trench while the others slept, and shoved him aside, which was unlike his usual courtesy, and had climbed out over the top. To Sara Lee this Hutin told his story. A short man with a red beard and a kindly smile that revealed teeth almost destroyed from neglect. He was at first diffident in the extreme. "It was the captain, mademoiselle," he asserted. "I know him well. He has often gone on his errands from very near my post. He smiled, "I am usually in the front line." "What did he do?" "He had no cap, mademoiselle. I thought that was odd. And as you know, he does not wear his own uniform on such occasions. But he wore his own uniform, so that at first I did not know what he intended." "Later on," she asked, "did you hear anything?" "The usual sniping, mademoiselle. Nothing more." "He went through the inundation." "How else could he go? Through the wire first, at the barrier, where there is an opening, if one knows the way. I saw him beyond it, by the light of a fusee. There is a road there, or what was once a road. He stood there. Then the lights went out." On a wild night in January Sara Lee inaugurated a new branch of service. There had been a delay in sending up to the front the men who had been on rest, and an incessant bombardment held the troops prisoners in their trenches. A field kitchen had been destroyed. The men were hungry, disheartened, wet through. They needed her, she felt. Even the little she could do would help. All the day she had made soup, and at evening Marie led from its dilapidated stable the little horse that Henri had once brought up, trundling its cart behind it. The boiler of the cart was scoured, a fire lighted in the firebox. Marie, a country girl, harnessed the shaggy little animal, but with tears of terror. "You will be killed, mademoiselle," she protested, weeping. "But I have gone before. Don't you remember the man whose wife was English, and how I wrote a letter for him before he died?" "What will become of the house if you are killed?" "Dear Marie," said Sara Lee, "that is all arranged for. You will send a Poperinghe for your aunt, and she will come until Mrs. Cameron or some one else can come from England. And you will stay on. Will you promise that?" Marie promised in a loud wail. "Of course I shall come back," said Sara Lee, stirring her soup preparatory to pouring it out. "I shall be very careful." "You will not come back, mademoiselle. You do not care to live, and to such—" "Those are the ones who live on," said Sara Lee gravely, and poured out her soup. She went quite alone. There was a great deal of noise, but no shells fell near her. She led the little horse by its head, and its presence gave her comfort. It had a sense that she had not, too, for it kept her on the road. In those still early days the Belgian trenches were quite accessible from the rear. There were no long tunnel ways to traverse to reach them. One went along through the darkness until the sound of men's voices, the glare of charcoal in the busket bored with holes, the flicker of a match, told of the buried army almost underfoot or huddled in its flimsy shelters behind the railway embankment. Beyond the lines a sentry stopped her, hailing her sharply. "Qui vive?" "It is I," she called through the rain. "I brought some chocolate and some soup." He lowered his bayonet. "Pass, mademoiselle." She went on, the rumbling of her little cart deadened by the Belgian guns. Through the nearby trenches that night went the word that near the repose of the angels, which was but a hole in the ground and scarcely reposeful, there was to be had hot soup and chocolate and cigarettes. A dozen or so at a time the men were allowed to come. Officers brought their great capes to keep the girl dry. Boards appeared as if by magic for her to stand on. The rain and the bombardment had both ceased, and a full moon made the lagoon across the embankment into a silver lake. When the last soup had been dipped from the tall boiler, when the final drops of chocolate had oozed from the faucet, Sara Lee turned and went back to the little house again. But before she went she stood a moment, staring across toward that land of the shadow on the other side, where Henri had gone and had not returned. Once, when the King had decorated her, she had wished that, wherever Uncle James might be, on the other side, he could see what was happening. And now she wondered if Henri could know that she had come back, and was again looking after his men while she waited for that reunion he had so firmly believed in. Then she led the little horse back along the road. At the poplar tree she turned and looked behind, toward the trenches. The grove was but a skeleton now, a strange and jagged thing of twisted branches, as though it had died in agony. She stood there while the pony nuzzled her gently. If she called, would he come? But, then, all of life was one call now, for her. She went on slowly. After that it was not unusual for her to go to the trenches on such nights as no men could come to the little house. Always she was joyously welcomed, and always on her way back she turned to send from the poplar trees that inarticulate aching call that she had come somehow to believe in. January, wet and raw, went by. February, colder with snow, was half over. The men had ceased to watch for Henri over the parapet, and his brave deeds had become fireside tales, to be told at home, if ever there were to be homes again for them. Then one night Henri came back. Came as he had gone, out of the shadows that had swallowed him up. Came without so much as the sound of a sniper's rifle to herald him. A strange, thin Henri, close to starvation, dripping water over everything from a German uniform, and very close indeed to death before he called out. There was wild excitement indeed. Bearded private soldiers, forgetting that name and rank of his which must not be told, patted his thin shoulders. Officers who had lived through such horrors as also may not be told crowded about him and shook hands with him and with each other. It was as though from the graveyard back in the fields had come, alive and smiling, some dearly beloved friend. He would have told the story, but he was wet and weary. "That can wait," they said, and led him, a motley band of officers and men intermixed, for once forgetting all decorum, toward the village. They overtook the lines of men who had left the trenches and were moving with their slow and weary gait up the road. The news spread through the column. There were muffled cheers. Figures stepped out of the darkness with hands out. Henri clasped as many as he could. When with his escort he had passed the men they fell, almost without orders, into columns of 4 and swung in behind him. There was no band, but from 1,000 throats, yet cautiously until they passed the poplar trees, there gradually swelled and grew a marching song. Behind Henri a strange guard of honor, muddy, tired, torn, even wounded, they marched and sang, "Trou la la, ça ne va guère, trou la la, ça ne va pas." Sara Lee, listening for that first shuffle of many feet that sounded so like the wind in the trees, or water over the pebbles of a brook, paused in her work and lifted her head. The rhythm of marching feet came through the wooden shutters. The very building seemed to vibrate with it, and there was a growing sound with it that soon she knew to be the deep voices of singing men. She went to the door and stood there, looking down the street. Behind her was the warm glow of the lamp, all the snug invitation of the little house. A group of soldiers had paused in front of the doorway, and from them one emerged, tall, white, infinitely weary, and looked up at her with unbelieving eyes. After all, there are no words for such meetings. Henri took her hand, still with that sense of unreality, and bent over it. Sara Lee touched his head as he stooped, because she had called for so long, and only now he had come. "So you have come back," she said in what she hoped was a composed tone, because a great many people were listening. He raised his head then and looked at her. "It is you who have come back, mademoiselle." There was gaiety in the little house that night. Every candle was lighted. They were stuck in rows on mantel shelves. They blazed and melted into strange arcs above the kitchen stove. There were cigarettes for everybody, and food, and a dry uniform, rather small, for Henri. Marie wept over her soup, and ran every few moments to the door to see if he was still there. She had kissed him on both cheeks when he came in, and showed signs, every now and then, of doing it again. Sara Lee did her bandaging as usual, but with shining eyes. And soon after Henri's arrival a dispatch rider set off post haste with certain papers and maps, hurriedly written and drawn. Henri had not only returned, he had brought back information of great value to all the Allied armies. So Sara Lee bandaged, and in the little room across the way, where no longer Harvey's photograph sat on the mantel, Henri told his story to the officers, of his imprisonment in the German prison at Crefeld, of his finding Jean there, weeks later when he was convalescing from typhoid, of their escape and long wandering, of Jean's getting into Holland whence he would return by way of England, of his own business, of what he had done behind the lines after Jean had gone. He said nothing, but his listeners knew and understood. But his dispatches off, his story briefly told, Henri wandered out among the men again. He was very happy. He had never thought to be so happy. He felt the touch on his sleeves of hard, brown, not overclean hands, infinitely tender and caressing, and over there, as though she had never gone, was Sara Lee, slightly flushed and very radiant. And as though he also had never gone away, Henri pushed in the salle à manger and stood before her smiling. "You bandage well, mademoiselle," he said gaily. "But I bandage better. See now, a turn here and it is done. Does it hurt, Paul?" The man in the dressing chair squirmed and grinned sheepishly. "The iodine," he explained. "It is painful." "Then I shall ask you a question and you will forget the iodine. Why is a dead German like the tail of a pig?" Paul failed. The room failed. Even Colonel Lilius confessed himself at fault. "Because it is the end of a swine," explained Henri, and looked about him triumphantly. A gust of laughter spread through the room and even to the kitchen. A door banged. Henri upset a chair. There was noise again, and gaiety in the little house of mercy, and much happiness. And here I think we may leave them all, Henri and Sara Lee, and Jean of the one eye and the faithful heart, and Marie with her kettles, and even Rene, who still in some strange way belonged to the little house, as though it were something too precious to abandon. The amazing interlude had become the play itself. Never again for Sara Lee would the lights go up in front, and Henri with his adoring eyes and open arms fade into the shadows. The drama of the war plays on. The great playwright sees fit, now and then, to take away some well-beloved players. New faces appear and disappear. The music is the thunder of many guns. Henri still plays his big part, and Sara Lee her little one. Yet who shall say, in the end, which one has done the better? There are new and ever new standards, but love remains the chief. And love is Sara Lee's one quality. Love of her kind, of tired men and weary. The love that shall one day knit this broken world together. And love of one man. On weary nights, when Henri is again lost in the shadows, Sara Lee, her work done, the men gone, sits in her little house of mercy and waits. The stars on clear evenings shine down on the roofless buildings, on the rubbish that was once the mill, on the ruined poplar trees, and on the small acre of peace where tiny crosses mark the long sleep of weary soldiers. And sometimes, though she knows it now by heart, she reads aloud that letter of Henri's to her. It comforts her. It is a promise. If that is to be, then think of me, somewhere, perhaps with Rene by my side, since he too loved you. And I shall be calling you, and waiting. Perhaps, even beyond the stars, they have need of a little house of mercy. And God knows, wherever I am, I shall have need of you.